Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you who listen to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, I'd appreciate it if you leave a like and subscribe to the video and write the number of the story in the comments that you thought was the scariest. So let's go. I had always found solace in the ocean. My friends and I made a habit of visiting the beach on summer evenings, setting up our blankets, and letting the waves soothe our worries. This night, however, was different. The air felt thicker, charged with an unsettling tension. The sky, a rich, dark blue, was almost completely covered in heavy clouds, but the moon, full and bright, pierced through, casting silvery lines across the water. We set up our spot close to the edge of the waves, the sea foam washing over our feet. We talked and laughed as the breeze whispered secrets only the sea knew. But, as the night deepened, the laughter died down, replaced by uneasy silence. It wasn't just the moonlight that made the water look strange. The tides had shifted, pulling out farther and faster than usual. The waves seemed to crash with a new force. They roared louder, almost like a warning. I stood up, the coarse sand biting at my ankles as I glanced out at the horizon. There was something in the water shape. It was too far to make out, but I knew I had seen it move. I shook my head, telling myself it was just a trick of the light. But when I turned to look at my friends, I saw that they, too, were staring out at the sea, their faces reflecting the same quiet fear I felt creeping up my spine. One of them, Emily, broke the silence. "Did you see that out there?" Before I could respond, a sudden, deafening splash sent a spray of salt water into the air. It was so close that the salty sting burned my eyes. I turned, my pulse racing as I scanned the shoreline, but there was nothing there. The others were scrambling to get up, eyes wide with fear. Then I heard it. A low, guttural growl, so deep and resonant that it felt like the sound vibrated inside my chest. It was coming from the water, only this time it was close enough to see closer than I could have imagined. A dark, slick form rose up from the depths, and I stumbled back, breathless. It had eyes, but not the kind that belonged to anything I could recognize. They were wide and glistening, filled with a malice that no living creature could muster. Its shape was monstrous, hunched and impossibly elongated, with limbs that twisted in directions they shouldn't. It screamed a sound that was neither human nor animal, but something primal and terrible. We ran, my heart slamming against my ribcage as I grabbed Emily's hand and pulled her behind me. The others were ahead, scrambling up the dunes, but I dared to look back. The creature, whatever it was, had emerged from the water, its limbs folding and snapping like a broken marionette as it moved toward us. I couldn't stop looking, even as my legs threatened to collapse under me. The creature was too alien, too unnatural, its body glistening with the water that dripped from its jagged, black scales. The sea was no longer a comforting lullaby. It had become a grave, a place where the monsters of the deep came to life. The path to the parking lot was a blur of shifting sand and wild shouts. We didn't stop until we reached the cars, slamming the doors and locking them behind us. The creature, impossibly fast, halted at the edge of the waves, its eyes trained on us, the taste of salt and terror thick in the air. It let out a final, bone-chilling roar that echoed over the water before it turned and slipped back into the sea, as if it had never been there. The police didn't believe us when we reported it. They chalked it up to a trick of the light or some strange marine animal, but none of us could ever forget what we had seen. And when I close my eyes at night, the sound of that roar still reverberates through my bones, and I know the creature is still there, lurking beneath the waves, waiting for the moon to call it back. I've always worked late shifts at the old city library. The building is massive, a maze of bookshelves and reading nooks, half-lit and musty. I loved it. It was quiet, save for the sound of the pages turning and the occasional hiss of the old, creaky radiator. But it wasn't until the winter storm hit that I discovered how easily something could hide within the shadows. That night, I was the only one there. The wind whistled through the cracked panes of glass, and the lights flickered sporadically. I pushed the thought of getting stuck inside the library out of my mind. I had a shift to finish. The snow piled up against the doors like an impenetrable wall, and I couldn't hear the city at all anymore. It felt like the whole world had gone silent. I stood up from the desk and stretched, looking over the vast sea of books. I made my way down the aisle of history, past the stacks of dusty volumes and the occasional antique globe. It was here, in the quiet solitude, that I noticed something moving out of the corner of my eye. I spun around, but the aisle was empty. Just rows upon rows of books, their spines blanketed in darkness. I pushed it aside and continued. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I stopped by the reference section, leaning against the oak desk. I swiped my phone out of habit. No signal. Of course. The library was a black hole for reception. The sudden jolt of the lights cutting out made me jump. The room plunged into darkness, and I felt a cold breath at the back of my neck. My heart slammed against my ribs, and I stumbled back, eyes searching for a source of the chill. The emergency lights came on, casting a blood-orange glow that made the old, dusty books appear as if they were bleeding. I shivered and tried to steady my breathing, but something didn't feel right. The silence returned, deeper and more suffocating. I swallowed hard, daring to move toward the staff room to check the circuit box. I was halfway across the room when I heard a sharp, wet slap behind me. I spun around, eyes going wide as they locked onto the source, a book, lying open on the floor, its pages moving as if stirred by some invisible hand. The pages whispered, the sound more like a breathing than a breeze. I crept closer, the soft crackling of the old floorboards beneath my feet. The book was open to a page I didn't recognize, a drawing in the margin of a hollow-eyed face with a grotesque grin. The lines seemed to shift as I stared. The eyes blinked, then looked straight at me. The distant creak of a chair moving in the staff room pulled my attention. I took a shaky breath, clutching the book to my chest, and turned to find the door ajar, a deep, unnatural shadow spilling out into the hallway. The scent of damp earth and something rotting reached me as I inched forward. I didn't remember leaving it open. The room was empty, but I noticed the far window, cracked and icy, was now wide open. The wind howled, pulling the pages of nearby books like they were alive. And then I heard a sound like a quiet giggle, sharp and full of malice. My pulse quickened, my skin crawling. In the dim light, I noticed it, a figure just inside the dark, its head too large for its shoulders, grinning wide, eyes empty but fixed on me. I backed up, the book slipping from my hands as I stumbled over my feet. It hit the floor with a thud that echoed like a drumbeat in the silence. Then it lunged. The next moment was a blur. I was out of the library and into the biting wind, not daring to look back, the giggle still ringing in my ears. The snow was so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, but I ran, faster than I ever had before. When I finally reached the street, the library's lights were out, completely dark. No more orange glow, no more whispers. Just the cold and the oppressive silence. The next day, when I went back to retrieve my things, the library was exactly as I had left it, the book lying open on the floor, the page with the face now blank. They never believed me. The others said I was just tired, imagining things. But every time I passed the library, I glanced at the window where I saw it watching me. And I swear it's still there, waiting. It was a quiet evening when we decided to drive out to the old orchard on the edge of town. I had heard stories about it being haunted, but they were just that, stories. I was with a group of friends, all of us looking for a break from the same old routine. The moon was full, casting a pale glow that made the rows of gnarled apple trees look like twisted, skeletal sentinels. As we parked the car and stepped out, the silence swallowed us whole. No rustle of leaves, no distant hum of traffic, just the cold wind cutting through the branches and the sound of our feet crunching over the gravel path. The air was heavy, as if it were holding its breath. We wandered through the orchard, laughing and daring each other to go farther. It was just a bit of fun, a way to make memories. But then we reached the center of the orchard, where the trees were so dense they blocked out most of the moonlight. The ground here was soft and spongy, and something felt off. One of my friends, Mark, bent down to pick up a rock, brushing his hand against the damp earth. "Hey, look at this," he said, holding up the rock. It was cracked, but that wasn't what made me freeze. It was the pale, sinewy root that curled around the rock, creeping like a finger. "Come on, that's just a root," Sarah said, but her voice trembled. The breeze picked up, carrying with it a low, groaning sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the orchard. We all looked at each other, uneasy. Suddenly, without warning, The ground beneath our feet shuddered. It was a soft tremor at first, but then it grew, vibrating so violently that I almost fell. In the panic, we shouted for each other to move, but no one wanted to break free of the circle we had formed. That's when I saw it. From between the twisted roots and the base of the trees, something emerged. It was thin, impossibly long, with limbs that bent in the wrong directions. Its skin was ashy gray, and its eyes were black wells that seemed to pull at my sanity. It reached out, claw-like hands stretched to the sky. "Run!" I yelled, and the group scattered, leaving me behind as I stumbled over the rough ground. The trees around us creaked and groaned as if alive, the roots shifting and moving like they were trying to trip us up, to pull us back into the dirt. I was the last to make it to the edge of the orchard, just as I reached the line of trees where the moonlight shone through. I glanced back and saw it standing there, watching me. The thing didn't follow, but its black eyes locked onto mine, and a shiver ran down my spine. It whispered something. The voice was the sound of scraping rock, a word I couldn't make out, but I knew it was speaking my name. I ran without stopping until I hit the road and found my friends, panting and wide-eyed. We didn't look back as we drove away, the engine roaring against the silence behind us. The next day, I returned to the orchard, wanting to prove to myself that it had been an illusion. But when I got there, it was just as it always had been, silent, desolate, a place that seemed forgotten. I noticed, however, that in the soil, where the rock had been picked up the night before, there was a shallow impression of a handprint, long, slender fingers etched in the dirt as if someone had pressed against the earth, trying to reach out. I left without saying a word to anyone. That night, as I lay in bed, the same whisper came back to me, this time louder, clearer. It called my name again, from somewhere far in the distance, and I knew it would never stop. The first time I went stargazing with my friends, I thought I was just looking for a break from the city lights. We drove out to the edge of the forest, where the sky was open and the stars stretched out like a black canvas, speckled with diamonds. It was late September, and the air had that sharp bite that spoke of autumn, but the night felt warm, full of stories waiting to be shared. We set up a blanket, cracked open sodas, and talked about everything from school to what we'd do when we graduated. But I noticed something strange. The deeper we got into the night, the quieter everything became. It was as if the forest itself had decided to hold its breath. The crickets had stopped chirping, and even the rustling of leaves seemed muted, as though the world had pressed pause. "Did you hear that?" my friend Chloe asked, breaking the silence. She was the first to notice it, a faint thump, rhythmic and heavy, coming from deeper in the trees. We looked at each other, trying to read expressions that had suddenly turned uneasy. "It's probably just a deer," I said, though my voice cracked, betraying my nerves. The thumping continued, louder now, growing closer, but still distant enough to be unsettling. Then it stopped. The silence returned, pressing in on us. I shivered and wrapped my arms around myself. Just as I was about to suggest we pack up, Chloe screamed. We all snapped our heads around, and there, standing at the edge of the tree line, was a figure. It was thin and bony, dressed in a tattered white shirt that fluttered in the wind like it was trying to escape. But it wasn't the figure that made my heart pound, it was the way it moved. Its limbs were twisted, jerking at odd angles like a marionette whose strings had been tangled. And its face was covered, the hood pulled so low that only the tips of its eyes peeked out, pale and wide, like they could see everything and nothing at the same time. "Go," Chloe whispered, eyes wide and breathless. We didn't need to be told twice. We scrambled up and sprinted to the car, my feet barely touching the ground as I ran. The trees seemed to part for us, their branches reaching out like fingers, pushing us back, but we made it. Slamming the door shut, I glanced at the rearview mirror and caught a glimpse of the figure standing at the edge of the clearing, motionless, just watching. I didn't see it again until weeks later, when the news reported the disappearance of a group of hikers who had gone missing in the same forest. Their bodies were never found, only a note left behind, written in a hand so scrawled it looked almost animalistic. "They know. They never stop." I thought it was a fluke, just a terrifying coincidence. But then, last night, I was driving home from a late shift, the road winding through the same woods. I saw the figure again, standing at the edge, staring with those wide, hollow eyes, and it wasn't just watching. It moved, limping forward, one jerky step after another, as if it was on its way to find me. I didn't stop. I floored the gas pedal and didn't look back, but the night wasn't over. In the rearview mirror, I saw it trailing behind, its movements growing more frantic, as if it had just remembered how to run. My breath caught, my pulse screamed, and the forest flashed past, nothing but darkness and the impossible shape that would haunt my dreams forever. When I made it home, my hands were shaking. I locked every door and closed all the blinds, but the sound still followed me, the rhythmic thumping, getting closer, always closer. It's been hours, and now the knock at the door has started. I'm not going to answer it, not now. Not ever. It knows I'm here, and it's not going away. I was a night shift security guard at the old, abandoned building downtown. It used to be a grand hotel back in the 1920s, one of those places where the rich and famous would gather. But times changed, and it was long past its glory days. Now, it was just an empty skeleton, creaking and groaning with every gust of wind. The job was straightforward: patrol the building, check the security cameras, and make sure no squatters or vandals had moved in. Most nights, it was uneventful. Just me, a thermos of coffee, and the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. But that night was different. I had just finished my third loop around the building when I heard something. It was faint, a low, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere above. I paused, straining to hear it better, and it stopped. I frowned. Maybe a pipe was rattling. Maybe a rat was skittering around. The place was falling apart. Anything was possible. But then I heard it again, louder this time, a knock that reverberated through the empty hallways. I darted down the corridor toward the source, my flashlight cutting a thin beam through the gloom. The sound led me to the ballroom on the top floor, where the air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. I hesitated at the doorway, the hairs on my neck standing on end. The ballroom had been stripped of all its grandeur long ago. Broken chandeliers hung like twisted metal skeletons, and the floorboards creaked under the weight of years of neglect. And then I heard it, a deep, guttural voice humming an old jazz tune. The same tune that had been the hotel's signature song in its prime. My breath caught in my throat. I knew I had to check it out. The voice was low, almost soothing, as if it was inviting me in. I stepped into the room, the beam of my flashlight catching on the cracked marble tiles and shattered glass. The voice stopped abruptly. Silence pressed down on me, suffocating and complete. I stood there, heart racing, waiting for something, anything, to happen. And then it did. The old record player, which I knew hadn't worked in decades, sputtered to life in the corner of the room. The haunting jazz tune filled the air, and a chill ran down my spine. I took a step forward, unsure whether I should investigate or flee. That was when I noticed it, a figure, sitting at the grand piano that had been gathering dust for years. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was dressed in a 1920s suit, with a fedora pulled low over his eyes. He played the piano with one hand, the other dripped casually over the keys. I could see his face, now pale, almost translucent, with a smile that was too wide and eyes that glowed like embers. I should have turned and run. I should have screamed, but my feet were rooted to the spot, my body frozen with terror. He tilted his head, and the smile widened, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too many. "Join me," he whispered, the voice echoing in the empty room. Before I could move, the room plunged into darkness. The music stopped, and I felt something brush against my neck, a cold, invisible touch that made me gasp and stumble backward. My flashlight flickered, casting shadows that seemed to shift and reach toward me. I bolted out of the room, running down the hallway as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I was back at the front entrance, gasping for air and half expecting to feel the cold touch on my neck again. I looked back at the building, the grand facade now seeming sinister, even in the dull glow of the street lights. The front doors creaked open slightly, as if someone, or something, was watching me from inside. I never went back to that job after that night. No amount of money could convince me to return. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear that jazz tune drifting down the street. And I know that in that abandoned hotel, someone is waiting for me to come back. I never thought anything could scare me like that night did. I was working the night shift at a small, 24-hour gas station, the kind that has the flickering neon sign and a single, worn-out bench for people to sit on. The station was in a town that felt abandoned at the dark, a place where the only noise was the wind rattling the old gas pumps and the occasional truck that drove through on the way to somewhere else. It was around 3 a.m. when the first strange thing happened. A black sedan pulled into the lot, its headlights cutting through the darkness like twin daggers. The sedan sat there for a moment too long, then pulled forward slowly, as if waiting for something. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to laugh it off. Maybe the driver was waiting for a friend. Maybe he was just tired. But then I noticed it, a shadow flitting across the windshield, moving so fast that I wasn't sure if I'd seen it at all. My heart thumped louder as I took a breath. Trying to steady myself, the car suddenly jerked forward, headlights flashing briefly in my direction before it sped off into the darkness. I watched it disappear down the long, empty road, my pulse pounding in my ears. Just as I was about to turn back to my work, I heard a noise behind me shuffling, like someone was dragging their feet across the cracked tile floor. I turned sharply, eyes wide. The place was empty except for me. I swallowed hard, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I went back to stocking the shelves, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. The night felt heavier, like something was pressing down on my chest. It was nearing 4 a.m. when the next car pulled in. This one was an old, rusty pickup truck, the kind that looked like it should have been retired decades ago. I looked out at it, the driver's side door creaking open slowly. But again, no one stepped out. I stepped back from the counter, heart slamming into my ribs as I stared at the open door. Then I saw him, a man, hunched over, moving with a jerky, unnatural gait. He shuffled toward the door of the gas station, eyes locked on mine, and I realized too late that he wasn't alone. Behind him, in the shadows of the truck bed, I saw a second figure. It shaped more like an elongated, cloud shadow than anything human. My hands went cold, and a shiver raced down my spine. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe as the man reached for the door handle. A high-pitched, inhuman screech split the silence, and I jumped, grabbing the phone from the counter and dialing 911 with shaking fingers. 911, what's your emergency? Came the voice on the other end. I couldn't speak, couldn't tear my eyes away as the first man's mouth stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of sharp, yellowed teeth. The shadow behind him stepped forward, and in the bright neon light, I saw its true form, a twisted, half-human shape, dripping with something dark and glistening. Its eyes, if they could be called that, were black and hollow, filled with a cold, infinite hunger. The dispatcher's voice brought me back to reality. Sir, are you there? What's happening? I opened my mouth to scream, but couldn't make a sound. The figures outside the window were moving, circling the building, and I knew I had only moments before they found a way in. The lights flickered, casting jagged shadows across the walls. I ducked behind the counter and waited, hearing the slapping sound of wet feet on tile as they moved closer. Then everything went silent. The silence was worse than any noise, and I knew that something had changed. I stood up cautiously and peeked over the counter, my chest aching with every breath. The gas station was empty. No figures, no strange sounds, just the hum of the refrigerator and the steady tick of the clock on the wall. The phone in my hand felt hot, like it had a pulse of its own. I could still hear the dispatcher on the line, asking if I was okay. I nodded, a shaky laugh escaping me as I whispered, "I'm okay now." But as I looked out the window, I noticed something chilling. The black sedan was back, parked across the street, engine idling. I stared at the rearview mirror, where a face stared back at me with eyes as hollow and dark as the figure that had been outside. They were still here. There's something unnerving about the woods at night, especially when you aren't supposed to be there. I didn't believe the stories, none of us did. My friends and I were spending a weekend at an old countryside house, the kind with creaky floors and endless fields stretching toward the tree line. It was remote, quiet, and perfect for hiking during the day. But when night fell, the woods took on a life of their own. On the second evening, after dinner, we decided to test a local legend we'd heard from one of the neighbors. The story went that deep in the forest, hidden in an overgrown clearing, was a ring of stones older than anyone could remember. They said the stones moved if you stared at them too long, shifting like shadows when you weren't looking. But the most important part of the story was this: never stay in the ring after midnight. We laughed about it, of course. It sounded ridiculous, like something cooked up to keep kids from wandering too far. So, armed with flashlights and a couple of beers, we headed into the woods to find the clearing. The moon was bright enough to guide us partway, its pale light cutting through the skeletal branches above. Everything else was silent. No crickets, no owls, not even the wind. It was like the woods were holding their breath. After about an hour of walking, we found it. The clearing was small, just a patch of bare earth surrounded by towering trees. In the center stood the stones, a rough circle no taller than my waist. They were worn smooth by time, moss clinging to their sides like green veins. There was something unsettling about the way they were arranged, almost a perfect, like they had been placed there by someone, or something, with intent. We joked about summoning ancient spirits and dared each other to step inside. Eventually, I caved and walked into the center of the ring, spinning around with mock solemnity. My friends clapped and laughed, their voices echoing strangely in the still air. For a moment, everything felt normal. Then the temperature dropped. I thought I imagined it at first, but my breath started to fog in front of me, and I saw my friends shiver. One of them asked if we should head back, but I waved them off, trying to lighten the mood. That's when the first stone moved. It wasn't dramatic, just a slight shift, like it had nudged itself an inch to the left. I laughed nervously, assuming it was a trick of the light. But then another stone shifted, sliding so silently it was almost imperceptible. My heart skipped a beat as I looked to my friends for reassurance, but their faces told me they'd seen it too. We stood frozen, our flashlights bouncing off the stones as they began to shift, one by one, closing the circle tighter around me. My legs felt like they were stuck in quicksand, and I couldn't force myself to move. One of my friends shouted at me to get out of the ring, but I couldn't hear them over the pounding in my ears. The stones stopped moving. The circle was smaller now, just barely wide enough for me to stand in. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me from all sides. Then came the whispers. They were faint at first, a low murmur that seemed to rise from the ground itself. Words I couldn't understand swirled around me, growing louder with each second. My friends were yelling at me to run, but the whispers drowned them out. My flashlight flickered, then died, plunging me into darkness. I don't know what made me snap out of it. Maybe it was the fear in my friend's voice, or the sudden realization that the stones were closing in again. I stumbled forward, tripping over my own feet as I hurled myself out of the ring. The moment I crossed the boundary, the whispers stopped. We didn't wait to see what would happen next. We ran, crashing through the underbrush until we burst out of the woods and into the field. My chest burned, my legs ached, but I didn't look back. The next morning, we returned to the clearing, convinced we had imagined the whole thing. But when we got there, the stones were gone. In their place was a single, freshly dug hole. Whatever we disturbed that night, it didn't want us coming back. We started our hike early, the sun just beginning to climb above the horizon, painting everything in soft hues of pink and gold. The weather was perfect, cool but not cold, with the kind of crisp air that filled your lungs and made you feel alive. The hike itself wasn't too difficult, and we made good time. The cliffs loomed ahead, their jagged edges sharp against the sky. By noon, we reached the highest point. We stopped to catch our breath and take in the view. Below, the ocean stretched out endlessly, its deep blue surface dotted with white caps. The rocks beneath our feet were slippery, but we were careful. There was no real danger, just awe at how wild and beautiful the world could be. We ate lunch on the cliffs, chatting about everything and nothing, when the first odd thing happened. At the far end of the cliff, just out of sight from where we were sitting, there was a figure. It wasn't someone from our group. This person was standing motionless, facing the ocean, a dark silhouette against the light. I squinted, trying to make out details, but they were too far away. I mentioned it to the others, but they just laughed it off. Probably someone else out here, Mark said. Lots of people hike this spot, but it felt strange. The figure didn't move, not even to adjust their posture, just standing still, unmoving. I turned away, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. It wasn't until we finished eating and packed up to leave that the figure became more troubling. We hadn't seen them leave, and the spot they were standing in was still empty. But the odd thing was, we now found fresh footprints in the dirt, footprints that led directly to the cliff's edge. I could tell they were recent, still deep and dark in the dirt, like someone had been standing right there only moments before. We followed the trail, but it led nowhere. The cliffs dropped sharply into the ocean below, with nothing but jagged rocks and a vast emptiness stretching out. There was no way the person could have just walked off the edge. It didn't make sense. I didn't say anything at the time, but the unease was growing in me. There was something wrong here. The longer I looked at the prints, the more unsettled I became. They didn't seem like the footprints of someone who had been hiking. They were too deliberate, too precise, like they had been placed there for a reason. I tried to push it out of my mind, but as we began heading back down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. My skin prickled with an invisible tension. We continued, laughing and talking, but I kept looking over my shoulder as the afternoon sun dipped lower. We began to make our way back toward the parking area. That's when I saw it again, the same figure. This time, they were not far from us, standing in the shadow of a large rock. Their back was to us, but I could see something clearly. They were holding something in their hands, something I couldn't identify, but it was too big and too unnatural to ignore. I stopped walking, and my friends turned to look at me. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked, her brow furrowing. "There's someone over there," I said, pointing. But when I looked again, the figure was gone. The space was empty. "Stop messing with us," Mark said, rolling his eyes. "There's no one there," but I was sure. I'd seen it clearly. My heart began to race. I wanted to leave, to get back to the car and drive far away from this place, but something made me stop. I wanted to believe I was imagining it, but deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. We reached the parking area just as the sun was setting. It was a small, gravel lot with a single path leading to the main road. As we neared the cars, I heard a sound, a low, grating noise, like something scraping against stone. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing behind us except the dense trees and the empty, silent cliff. But then, I heard something else, a voice. It was faint, carried by the wind, but it was unmistakable. The voice was saying my name. I froze. It wasn't one of my friends. It was a voice I didn't recognize, soft but clear, as if it had been waiting for me to hear it. "Don't leave." I snapped around to face my friends, but they were already piling into the cars, unaware of the chill that had run down my spine. I didn't tell them what I'd heard. I didn't want to sound crazy. I just wanted to get out of there. We left the cliffs, the strange voice still echoing in my mind. The car ride back was quiet, everyone too exhausted to talk. But when I got home later that night, I noticed something on my phone, a new notification, a picture. It was a photo of me, taken from behind, standing on the edge of the cliffs. But I was alone in the photo. The figure was nowhere to be seen. And then, I noticed something chilling in the background. There was someone else in the shadows, just out of view, watching me from a distance. The first time I saw the old man, I thought he was just a local, wandering through the market like everyone else. It was late afternoon, the sun a lazy disk in the sky, painting the city in hues of gold and shadow. I was at the open-air market, the kind with vendors yelling about their wares, hawking everything from fresh fruit to handmade jewelry. I always loved coming here. It was a small escape from the monotony of my life. He was standing by the flower stall, head bent, as if examining the petals. He was tall and thin, with a face creased into a labyrinth of wrinkles, eyes clouded and pale. When I caught him staring, I looked away quickly, my skin crawling. I shrugged it off. Maybe he was just an old man, lonely and curious. I didn't see him again until later, that evening when I was walking home, weaving through the narrow, cobbled streets. The sky had darkened, and the street lamps cast long, flickering pools of light across the pavement. As I passed an abandoned building, I heard the sound of shuffling feet behind me. I turned, and there he was, his pale eyes fixed on me, hands shaking at his sides. "Are you following me?" I called out, my voice firmer than I felt. He stopped, tilted his head, and said something so low I couldn't make out the words, but the way he looked at me sent a shiver down my spine, as if he knew something I didn't. I quickened my pace, heart thundering in my chest. The sound of his footsteps echoed after me until I reached the safety of the busy street where people still lingered, chatting and laughing. I dared a glance over my shoulder, but he had vanished. The next day, I woke up to a strange feeling, the air in my room heavy and suffocating. It was the kind of feeling that makes you check the locks on your doors, make sure every window is secure. I told myself it was just paranoia, but when I pulled open the curtains, my heart almost stopped. There, in the alleyway just across from my apartment, the old man stood. He stared, unmoving, his eyes wide and hollow. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, he raised a hand and pointed directly at me. A rush of icy dread shot through me. I slammed the window shut, the thud shaking the walls. I didn't go to work that day. I couldn't. I stayed home, peeking through the blinds, waiting for him to reappear. Hours passed, the light shifting from morning to afternoon, but he didn't come back. Just as I let out a shaky breath, there was a knock at the door. I hesitated, frozen, and then a voice called out, "Hello, miss. Are you okay? It's the building manager. We've had reports of strange activity." I opened the door a crack, heart hammering. He stood there in a neat, gray uniform, eyes kind but curious. I nodded, mutely, and he continued, "We've been getting complaints about someone lurking in the alley. Any idea who it might be?" I tried to speak, but couldn't. Finally, I managed to say, "An old man. He's been watching me." The manager raised an eyebrow. "There's no one out there now, but we've had similar reports for weeks. People say he appears and disappears like a shadow, never coming any closer." My blood ran cold. "Do you know who he is?" The manager shook his head. "He's been around for years. People say he's a ghost, or something worse. But he only appears to those who need to see him. Stay inside tonight, miss." I thanked him, my voice trembling, and shut the door. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every noise, every creak of the floorboards, had me on edge. Then, around 3 a.m., I heard a faint tapping at the window. Light as a feather, I couldn't help myself. I pulled the curtains aside, and there he was, standing in the dark, one hand pressed to the glass as if trying to push through. Before I could scream, he whispered in a voice barely audible, "You're not safe." The glass fogged up with his breath, and a shape appeared, a face. My own face, but older, withered and cracked, eyes hollow and dark. I stumbled back, gasping. He vanished into the night, leaving only the chill and the echo of those words. It's been years now, and I've never seen him again. But sometimes, when the wind howls just right or when the street lamps flicker in the dark, I swear I feel that cold, hollow stare, waiting, watching, and I know he's still out there, looking for the next one to hear his warning. The sun was just starting to dip below the horizon as I walked back from the market, the light splintering through the trees and casting long, jagged shadows on the gravel path. I had spent the day on the farm, helping out with chores and picking up supplies. The farm belonged to an old couple who lived at the far end of the property, and I had agreed to run their errands while they rested. The path I was on led through a dense section of woods, a shortcut that shaved off nearly half a mile. The trees were gnarled and twisted, their leaves like dark, jagged teeth against the deepening sky. The woods were never truly silent, but tonight there was something else, a low, rhythmic thumping that seemed to come from the direction of the clearing. I paused, my fingers tightening around the handle of my basket. The thumping continued, steady and deep, like the sound of something heavy being struck over and over. I took a breath, telling myself it was probably just the wind moving the branches. But the air felt thick and close, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. My footfalls quickened as I pressed on, each step sounding louder in the stillness. The path narrowed, the woods seeming to lean in around me like watchful eyes. I glanced behind me, heart skipping a beat as I caught sight of something at the edge of the woods, a figure standing just beyond the trees, hidden in the deepening shadows. The thumping sound grew louder now, closer, as if whatever was making it was moving along the path toward me. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my basket as a sharp, bone-chilling scream split the air. It was human but distorted, like it had been pulled through a funnel of raw static. My blood froze in my veins. I turned and sprinted, feet pounding on the gravel as I pushed through the brambles and thorns that clawed at my skin. The scream sounded again, closer, louder, until it was a banshee wail echoing in my ears. I didn't dare look back, focusing instead on the pale glow of the farm's porch light ahead. My breath was ragged by the time I reached the clearing. The porch light blinked on, its yellow hue casting an eerie glow across the yard. I ran up to the front door and hammered on it, eyes darting to the woods behind me, expecting to see something emerge. The sound of the thumping stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep silence that seemed almost deafening. The door creaked open, and the old man peered out, eyes wide with concern. I tried to catch my breath, but the words caught in my throat. He put a hand on my shoulder, guiding me inside, away from the oppressive night. "Are you all right, dear?" he asked, his voice trembling. I nodded, unable to speak. I wanted to tell him what I'd heard, what I'd seen, but my voice had turned to ashes. Just then, there was a knock at the back door, sharp and urgent. We both turned to look at it, the old man's face draining of color. "Who's there?" he called out, but there was no response, just a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. A cold, clammy hand touched my arm from behind, and I spun around, my vision blurring with tears of panic. But there was nothing there. The knock came again, louder this time, as if whatever was at the door was pushing against it, testing its strength. The old man reached for the key hanging by the door, but I grabbed his arm, shaking my head. I glanced out the small window by the door and caught sight of a figure in the moonlight, too far to make out clearly, but the eyes cold and unblinking stared straight at me. The scream came again, not from the woods, but from right outside the door, the sound making my ears feel like they were going to split open. The old man's hands trembled as he unlocked the door, and I knew then that whatever was out there wasn't something that could be kept out. The door swung open, revealing nothing but night, and in that silence, a voice rasped, barely audible, "Let me in." It wasn't the old man's voice. It wasn't human. I backed away, clutching the basket to my chest as the light flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The scream, now a whisper, seemed to seep through the walls as the door slammed shut behind me. The knocking stopped. The night started out like any other. I was out with my sister on a late-night walk along the riverbank, the kind that's more about talking and unwinding than anything else. It was fall, and the leaves were like fire on the trees, glowing under the dim moonlight. We had been talking about everything and nothing, our laughter echoing against the water. We walked a good distance from the street lights, far enough to be swallowed by the general darkness. The city was just a smudge in the distance, a heartbeat I could barely hear. The river murmured alongside us, its surface shimmering with the moon's pale gaze. I was just about to ask her what she wanted for her birthday when I heard it, a sound. It was faint, but distinct, a splashing noise. I paused, my gaze darting to the water. "Did you hear that?" I asked. She looked at me with wide eyes, then shook her head. I could feel the cool night air pressing against my skin, making me shiver. It was almost like the river was alive, a giant creature whispering something I couldn't understand. I didn't want to look away, but I did, turning my head back to her and forcing a smile. "Probably just a fish," I said, but my voice was more unsure than I'd intended. Then we heard it again, this time louder and closer. It was a splashing, but not just one. It was a series of splashes, rhythmic, deliberate. I spun around, heart racing. The surface of the water rippled, churning as if something unseen was moving underneath. Before I could speak, a figure shot out of the water, draped in wet, tangled hair and clothes that clung to its skeletal frame. Its eyes were empty, black as the deepest night. It reached out, clawed fingers outstretched, and its mouth fell open in a silent scream. I grabbed my sister's arm, pulling her backward as the creature lunged. It hit the bank with a sickening thud and clawed itself toward us, dragging its body with an unnatural, jerky motion. We stumbled and ran, gasping for breath as we tore through the trees, their branches snagging at our clothes. My sister tripped and fell, and I turned around, my chest already burning from the effort. It was right there, only a few feet away. Its wet eyes locked onto mine, and I couldn't move, couldn't scream. But then, just as suddenly as it had emerged, it froze, its head tilting as if listening to something I couldn't hear. A whistle, low and guttural, like something shifting in the dark. It was coming from the woods. The creature's mouth shut, and for a second, I thought it was about to retreat. Then it turned its head to the source of the sound, its movements quick and sharp. The dark woods behind us seemed to shiver as something else emerged. Another figure, its shape indistinguishable but bigger, moving with a rhythm that didn't belong to anything human. My sister pulled on my arm, her eyes wide with terror. "We have to go now," she shouted, and I stumbled, barely catching myself before we ran, the sound of wet footsteps pounding after us. We didn't stop until we reached the safety of the nearest street light, our breath ragged, our legs shaking. The creature didn't follow. It stayed there, at the edge of the woods, staring, the inky darkness of its eyes glistening under the moon. I glanced back once more before we sprinted home, every step feeling like it could be our last stop the next morning. I went back to the river, heart heavy and fists clenched. I found the spot where we'd seen it, hoping to make sense of what happened. The water was still, the surface unmod. There was no sign of anything abnormal, just the calm flow of the river, the rustle of leaves, and the whispering wind. But on the ground, near the edge, was a single, tiny footprint, wet and shaped like a child's, and the sound of a whistle, sharp and low, came from the woods behind me. The weekend getaway was supposed to be a break from the city, a chance to relax in a secluded cabin. My friends and I rented a small place deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. It was the perfect setting, remote, quiet, and peaceful. To peaceful, I would later realize. We arrived on Friday night, and the air had that crisp autumn chill. There was a slight breeze that rustled the trees, but other than that, it was eerily still. The cabin itself looked charming enough, with its wooden beams and stone fireplace. We unpacked, cracked open some beers, and gathered around the fire. The warm glow of the flames made everything feel cozy, and I felt the tension of the past few weeks slip away. As the night wore on, we talked about anything and everything, old memories, silly anecdotes, and a few ghost stories. Nothing too serious, just the usual campfire chatter. I didn't believe in any of it. I was always the skeptic, the one who rolled my eyes when someone brought up ghosts or spirits. We eventually decided to call it a night. I headed upstairs to the bedroom I was sharing with my friend, Hannah. It wasn't until I was lying in bed that I noticed something strange. The air felt unnervingly cold, despite the fire downstairs. I pulled the blankets tighter around me, brushing it off as nothing. But then, from downstairs, I heard something odd, a scraping sound. I told myself it was probably just the wind or something settling in the house, but it wasn't just a creak or groan. It sounded deliberate, like something was dragging across the floor. I lay still, listening. The sound stopped, then started again, but this time, it was accompanied by a soft knock on the door. My heart skipped a beat. I got out of bed and crept to the top of the stairs, straining to hear. The knocking continued. It wasn't loud, but the rhythmic pattern made me shiver. As I descended cautiously, I thought I saw a shadow flicker near the door at the bottom of the stairs. I stopped, my pulse quickening. "Is someone there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I reached the door. My hand hovered over the handle, but something in me told me not to open it. Instead, I went back upstairs to wake Hannah, but when I turned the corner into the bedroom, she was standing by the window, staring out into the darkness. "Hannah?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She didn't respond. I stepped closer and touched her shoulder. The second my fingers made contact, she spun around, her eyes wide and blank, like she wasn't seeing me at all. A sharp chill ran down my spine. "Hannah." "What's wrong?" I said, shaking her lightly. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Her gaze stayed fixed, locked on something outside the window. Slowly, she took a few steps toward the door and stopped. "That's not us," she finally whispered. I was confused. "What do you mean?" She didn't answer. Instead, she reached for the door and slowly turned the handle. The door creaked open, and in the hallway, standing just beyond the threshold, was us, my exact reflection, but twisted and wrong, eyes sunken, mouth stretched into a sickening grin. I froze, too terrified to move. The figure that looked like me took a step forward, then another. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The reflection stepped closer to the door. A chilling breeze swept through the room, despite the lack of an open window. Suddenly, the figure grinned wider, its face contorting in a grotesque smile. "Let us in," it said in a voice that was mine, but not mine at all. I slammed the door shut, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The knocking began again, but this time, it wasn't just the door. It was every wall, every window, each thud echoing in a synchronized rhythm. We ran. Downstairs, out the door, into the night. We didn't look back. The next morning, we packed up and left. The others didn't seem as disturbed, but I could still feel that icy cold in the back of my neck. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't the only ones in the cabin. And somewhere in those woods, something was still knocking on the walls, waiting for the next group to believe it was just a story. It started with Adair, my cousin, my best friend, and I were spending the weekend at my uncle's remote cabin in the woods. The cabin was old and creaky, surrounded by dense forest, with no neighbors for miles. My uncle had warned us not to go near the abandoned well out back. He said it was unsafe, but the way he avoided talking about it made it sound like there was more to the story. Naturally, that made it the most interesting thing about the place. After a day of hiking and exploring, the conversation drifted back to the well. My cousin, ever the instigator, dared me to go out there at night and knock on the stones. I tried to laugh it off, but the teasing started. They called me a chicken, and that was all it took. I grabbed a flashlight, stepped into my boots, and made my way toward the well, my friends trailing behind to ensure I didn't back out. The well was in worse shape than I expected. The stones were slick with moss, and weeds grew wild around its base. The flashlight's beam barely penetrated the blackness below, revealing only damp, ancient bricks descending into nothingness. My cousin nudged me, urging me to get on with it. I hesitated, then leaned forward and gave the side of the well a solid knock. The sound echoed unnaturally, hollow and metallic, far deeper than I thought possible. It shouldn't have echoed like that. I straightened up, unease creeping in. Just as I was about to turn away, a faint noise drifted up from the darkness below. It was so faint at first that I thought I imagined it, but then it grew louder. Clearer. It was the sound of someone knocking back. We froze. My cousin laughed nervously, insisting it had to be an echo. But the knocks came again, faster now, more deliberate. It was not an echo. The knocks were uneven, like fingers tapping rhythmically against stone. I turned to leave, but my flashlight caught something near the base of the well. Scratches on the stones, faint but visible, as if someone had clawed at the bricks in desperation. My best friend pointed it out, his voice trembling as he asked if we were sure the well was abandoned. We were all staring at the marks when the knocking stopped, replaced by a new sound. A voice, faint and scratchy, rising from the depths. It didn't sound like a person. It was warped, as if spoken through water, but unmistakably a voice, muttering words we couldn't make out. My cousin grabbed my arm and whispered that it was time to go. We all agreed without hesitation. As we turned to leave, the flashlight flickered, plunging us into darkness. My heart raced as I slapped the side of the light, desperate to get it working again. When it finally flickered back to life, the beam caught something that made my blood run cold. A hand, pale and emaciated, was reaching over the edge of the well. I screamed, and we bolted for the cabin, stumbling over roots and rocks in our panic. We didn't stop until we were inside, locking the door behind us. My uncle wasn't due back until the next day, and none of us wanted to be the one to suggest going outside again to check. We tried to calm ourselves down, convincing each other it had to be a trick of the light or our imaginations. Still, none of us slept that night. Every creak of the cabin and rustle of the wind had us on edge. In the morning, sunlight brought a fragile sense of normalcy. We ventured back to the well in the safety of daylight, determined to prove it was just our minds playing tricks on us. The scratches were still there, as vivid as ever, but there was no sign of the hand or anything else unusual. But then we noticed something chilling. The moss on the stones had been disturbed, long streaks dragged toward the top of the well, as if something had been climbing out. And at the base of the well, leading into the woods, were fresh footprints in the mud. Bare human footprints. A few months ago, my friends and I decided to go on a weekend camping trip. We picked a remote spot deep in the woods, away from the usual crowded campsites. The idea was simple: get some fresh air, disconnect, and enjoy the quiet beauty of nature. But from the moment we arrived, something about the place felt off. The trees were thick, and the air was unnaturally still. No birds, no whine, just silence. We shrugged it off as a normal part of the wilderness and set up our tents. The forest around us seemed untouched, ancient even. The ground was soft, damp with moss, and the only sounds came from the occasional snap of a twig underfoot as we explored. That night, after we cooked our dinner, we gathered around the fire, telling stories and laughing. The fire crackled loudly, but beyond its reach, the darkness was impenetrable. It was unsettling. My friends noticed it too, but none of us wanted to admit it. After a few beers, we agreed to head to our tents to sleep. I was the last one to crawl into my tent, the sound of my zipper feeling too loud in the silence. The night was heavy. I lay there, trying to fall asleep, but the quiet gnawed at me. Then, faintly, I heard something, a soft shuffle, like footsteps on the forest floor. I froze. It was far too soft to be an animal. I slowly unzipped my tent and peeked outside, scanning the darkness. Nothing, just trees and the distant glow of the fire. I told myself I was imagining things and zipped the tent back up, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling of my tent, listening to every rustle, every sigh of the wind through the branches. Hours passed. Then, just as I was about to drift off, I heard it again, closer this time. A distinct shuffle, followed by a low, almost imperceptible whisper. My heart pounded as I listened, trying to make sense of it. The whisper sounded like words, but I couldn't make them out. I lay there, terrified, holding my breath. The whisper came again, louder this time, and I could hear it clearly. "Get out," it said. I froze, barely daring to breathe. I thought maybe it was one of my friends playing a joke, but no one had moved, and the tents were eerily still. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent, and shined it into the night. Nothing, just the trees swaying, casting long shadows in the dim light. My heart raced as I scanned the area, but there was no sign of anyone. I stepped out of the tent, my flashlight trembling in my hands, and called out to my friends. No answer. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something was wrong, and I wasn't alone. I heard the shuffle again, followed by another whisper, but this time, it wasn't from the trees. It came from the direction of my friends' tents. Help? I immediately ran toward their tents, yelling their names. They quickly emerged, looking disoriented and confused. We gathered in a circle, nervously scanning the woods. That's when we heard it again, this time unmistakably close. "Get out." We weren't sure what to do, so we quickly packed up and decided to leave the area. But, as we gathered our things, we noticed something strange. In the dirt near the fire pit were tracks. Deep, heavy footprints, much too large to belong to any of us. They led into the woods, right toward the area where we had been hearing the whispers. We stood there, paralyzed with fear. The tracks weren't just in one direction, they circled our campsite, as if something had been moving around us all night. One of my friends, desperate to make sense of it, grabbed his phone and checked the GPS, but when he tried to pull up the map, his phone's screen flickered and went black. No signal, no connection. It was as if the forest was blocking us out, cutting us off from the outside world. Without saying another word, we grabbed our bags and hurried back toward the trailhead. As we moved, I couldn't help but feel eyes on us, the weight of the woods pressing in. The whispers didn't stop, they followed us, getting louder, more frantic. Finally, after what felt like hours of rushing through the woods, we made it to the road. We collapsed by the car, gasping for breath. The night was silent once again, as though nothing had ever happened. We drove away without looking back, and none of us spoke a word until we were well out of the woods. It wasn't until later, when we were looking through the photos from the trip, that we realized something that made my blood run cold. In one of the pictures, taken just before we packed up to leave, there was a face. It was faint, hidden in the trees behind us, staring directly at the camera. It had no eyes, just dark, hollow sockets. We didn't go back to those woods, and we never will, but the whispers haven't stopped. They're still there, sometimes when I'm alone, always saying the same thing: get out. I was working the night shift as a park ranger, a job I had loved since I began. It was late October, and the forest had a magical quality about it, with the leaves turning vibrant shades of red and gold. That night, the air was thick with an unsettling stillness. I had just finished checking the trails and was preparing to return to the ranger station when the radio crackled to life. A voice emerged, shaky and frightened. It was a family camping about a mile deep in the woods. They said they heard something outside their tent, something big that had been pacing around for hours. I could hear the panic in the father's voice, urging me to come quickly. I reassured him, telling him it was probably just a bear. I grabbed my flashlight and set off down the winding path, hoping to ease their fears. The moonlight barely penetrated the dense canopy above, casting eerie shadows that danced with the rustling leaves. As I moved deeper into the woods, I felt a chill run down my spine. The sound of my boots crunching on fallen twigs was the only noise accompanying me. I turned on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, and I called out to the family as I approached their campsite. The tent stood eerily still, the only movement coming from the wind tugging at the flaps. My heart raced as I called out again, but there was no response. The father had promised they would be awake, but it was as if the night had swallowed them whole. I stepped closer and noticed the tent zipper was slightly open. Something was off. I cautiously unzipped the tent and shined my flashlight inside. It was empty. The sleeping bags lay sprawled across the ground, still warm, but there was no sign of the family. Panic surged through me as I stepped back and scanned the area. That's when I heard a low growl emanating from the trees. It was not an animal's growl. It sounded human, guttural and strained. I turned the flashlight toward the sound, heart pounding as I caught a glimpse of something moving behind the trees. A figure, tall and gaunt, emerged from the shadows. It looked like a man, but was far too thin, its limbs elongated and twisted. It didn't walk. It glided toward me, its eyes reflecting the light like two coals burning in the night. I stumbled backward, fear gripping me as it stepped closer. I spun around and bolted back down the path, adrenaline surging through my veins. The growl grew louder, now accompanied by footsteps that echoed behind me. I dashed through the underbrush, branches clawing at my clothes. I dared not look back, focusing instead on the beam of my flashlight slicing through the darkness ahead. As I neared the main trail, I could feel the figure closing in. My heart raced, each beat pounding in my ears. I burst onto the main road, my breath ragged. Just as I thought I was safe, I tripped over a tree root and fell hard onto the dirt, the flashlight skidding away from my grasp. The growl was deafening now, a horrible cacophony of rage and desperation. I scrambled to my feet and reached for the flashlight, but as my fingers closed around the cool metal, I felt a hot breath on my neck. I froze, terror coursing through my body. With a sudden rush of instinct, I turned and swung the flashlight behind me, shining the beam into the face of my pursuer. But it wasn't the terrifying creature I expected. Instead, it was a deer doe with big, frightened eyes. It stood frozen, staring at me, seemingly just as scared as I was. I stood there, bewildered, the growling sound fading into the night. It dawned on me that the family had probably packed up and left in fear. I took a deep breath and gathered my thoughts, glancing around. There were no signs of the creature, just the rustling leaves and the gentle sway of the trees. When I made my way back to the ranger station, I realized that sometimes our minds can conjure the most terrifying monsters. In the stillness of the woods, fear had twisted my perception of reality. The shadows played tricks on me, and the fears of the night had become a tangible monster. Yet, as I sat down at my desk, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. Something lurked beyond the trees, just out of sight, reminding me that the dark holds more than just the fear of what we see. It also contains the shadows of our imagination. I had been a park ranger for a few years, spending countless nights in the woods and feeling a sense of peace in the rustling leaves and the sounds of nature. But that October night, everything changed. The sky was dark, thick clouds cloaking the moon, and the air was heavy with an unsettling stillness. As I patrolled the trails, the crunch of leaves under my boots was the only sound, making me hyper-aware of my surroundings. I was nearing a remote campsite when my radio crackled to life. A distressed voice came through. A group of campers had reported hearing strange noises outside their tents. The father insisted it sounded like someone or something was moving around their campsite, heavy footfalls and a low growl. I tried to calm him down, assuring him that it was probably just a bear, but I could hear the fear in his voice. After gathering my gear, I set off toward the campsite. The path was winding and overgrown, making it hard to see far ahead. With my flashlight cutting through the darkness, the trees cast long, eerie shadows that danced around me. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled as I pressed forward, the feeling of being watched creeping in. When I finally reached their campsite, the first thing I noticed was the unsettling silence. I called out, but there was no response. I stepped closer and found the tent zipped up tight, a warning sign that sent a chill down my spine. I unzipped the door and peeked inside. It was empty, the sleeping bags neatly arranged as if no one had ever been there. My heart raced as I turned to look around the campsite. Suddenly, I heard a rustling noise from the bushes nearby. I whipped around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. There, just beyond the tree line, I saw a figure. It was tall and unnaturally thin, moving with a jerky, unsettling gait. I called out, trying to sound authoritative, but my voice cracked. The figure stopped and turned its head slowly, revealing hollow, black eyes that seemed to absorb the light. I stumbled back, adrenaline surging through me. I remembered my training and reached for my radio, but the words got stuck in my throat. The figure didn't advance. It simply stood there, watching me. The woods around us felt like they were holding their breath, the air thick with anticipation. I turned and sprinted back down the path, my mind racing. I could hear branches snapping behind me and the sound of something following, moving faster than it should have been. As I ran, I could feel the weight of the woods pressing in on me, the trees towering like sentinels. I burst out onto the main trail and didn't stop until I reached my truck. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking, and finally got inside, slamming the door shut. I took a moment to catch my breath before calling for backup, explaining the situation as calmly as I could, but inside I was a mess. While I waited for the other rangers to arrive, I decided to circle back to the campsite. Maybe I could find the family and lead them to safety. As I approached, I felt a sense of dread wash over me. The area looked different, almost distorted. I scanned the trees but saw no sign of the figure. The tent was still zipped up tight, and the campsite was eerily quiet. I crept closer, my flashlight beam trembling. I unzipped the tent once more, but this time, it was empty. My heart sank. Where had they gone? A rustling noise drew my attention again, and I turned just in time to see the figure dart between the trees. Panic surged, and I turned to run, but as I did, I tripped over something hidden in the leaves. I fell forward and looked back. The figure was right there, only inches from me. But as I scrambled to my feet, something strange happened. The creature changed shape, morphing into the father from the camping family, his face twisted with fear. I blinked, and he vanished, replaced by shadows that danced among the trees. I stumbled back toward the road, my mind racing with confusion. Just as I reached the trailhead, the other rangers arrived. I told them everything, but as we searched the woods, we found nothing. No campers, no sign of a struggle, just an overwhelming silence. Days later, the park officials declared the area closed until further notice. But sometimes, when I walk the trails alone at night, I can still hear the rustling of leaves and that haunting growl. I wonder if the woods still hold the family, or if they became part of something far darker. The figure I saw, the one that looked like the father, was never found, and I can't shake the feeling that whatever I encountered in those woods still lingers, watching and waiting. As a park ranger, I've spent countless nights in the deep woods, patrolling the trails and ensuring the safety of campers. I thought I'd seen it all until one autumn evening when everything changed. It was late October, and the air was crisp with the promise of an early frost. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. I was on my usual patrol route when I noticed something strange, a flickering light deep within the forest. I dismissed it at first, thinking it was just a camper trying to set up their fire. But something about the light felt off. It wasn't steady like a campfire. It danced erratically, almost like it was alive. Curiosity got the better of me. I hiked toward the light, my boots crunching on the fallen leaves. As I drew closer, I heard laughter, high-pitched and disjointed, echoing through the trees. It sent a shiver down my spine. The laughter was not the joyful sound of campers enjoying themselves. It felt sinister, mocking. I hesitated, torn between my duty to investigate and the instinct to turn back. Just then, my radio crackled to life. Another ranger was calling in a report of strange noises coming from the woods. He described something similar, a flickering light and laughter that didn't sound human. My heart raced. This wasn't just my imagination. Something was happening. I pushed on, forcing myself to focus. As I neared the source of the light, I stumbled into a clearing. The sight took my breath away. In the center stood a large bonfire, flames leaping high into the night sky. Around it danced a group of figures, their movements jerky and erratic. They wore ragged clothes and masks made of twigs and leaves, their faces obscured. They twisted and spun, their laughter growing louder, filling the air with a chaotic energy frozen in place. I watched as they danced around the fire. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to stay quiet. I needed to gather information. Suddenly, one of them turned, and for a brief moment, our eyes met. Its gaze pierced through me, and I felt a chill seep into my bones. In that instant, I realized they weren't human. As if sensing my fear, the group stopped dancing and turned to face me. The leader stepped forward, its mask peeling back to reveal a face that was not a face at all, just a smooth, featureless surface where eyes and mouth should be. I stumbled back, my heart pounding as I turned to flee. I ran through the forest, branches snagging at my clothes, the laughter of the figures echoing behind me, taunting. I raced back toward my truck, my lungs burning. I could still hear them behind me, their laughter morphing into a cacophony of whispers, chanting my name. It felt like they were calling me, urging me to join their twisted celebration. I reached my truck, fumbled with the keys, and slammed the door shut. I locked it, trembling as I glanced back at the dark woods. Just as I started the engine, I saw movement in the rearview mirror. One of the figures was standing at the edge of the clearing, staring at me, its head cocked to one side. I peeled out of the parking lot, my heart racing, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I had never driven so fast down those narrow, winding roads. Finally, I reached the ranger station. I burst through the doors, breathless, and tried to explain what I had seen. But the other rangers dismissed my fears. They insisted it was likely a group of pranksters or local kids playing tricks. They laughed it off, saying I was just spooked by the dark, but I knew what I had seen. I decided to take a group back with me to the clearing, determined to prove I wasn't imagining things. We hiked back to the spot, but the fire was gone. The clearing was empty, devoid of any sign of life. The laughter had ceased, leaving only an eerie silence in its wake. We searched the area, but there was nothing. No tracks, no burned logs, just the whispering wind through the trees. As we started to leave, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, an old, gnarled tree with a deep hollow in its trunk. I approached it, feeling a strange pull. Inside the hollow was a collection of masks, just like the ones I had seen that night. Each mask was crafted from twisted branches and leaves, eerily familiar. It struck me then, I had not escaped them at all. They had wanted me to see, to witness their world. I had thought I was the one investigating, but I was merely a visitor in their realm. As we left the clearing, I felt a chilling realization settle in. They were still watching, still waiting, and the forest held secrets that would never be unearthed. I had always loved camping, the smell of pine trees and the sound of a crackling campfire. This time, I was with a few friends, excited to escape the city and enjoy the peace of nature. We hiked deep into the woods, setting up our tents in a secluded clearing surrounded by towering trees. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows that danced across the ground as we gathered around the fire. As night fell, we cooked hot dogs and shared stories, laughing as the stars twinkled overhead. Yena suggested we tell scary stories, which quickly turned into a competition to see who could come up with the creepiest tale. Each story was scarier than the last, but we were all still feeling brave and enjoying the thrill of it. That's when Matt had the brilliant idea to take a night hike. He insisted it would be fun and adventurous, and despite my unease, we all agreed. We grabbed our flashlights and started down the narrow path that led deeper into the woods. The beams of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees that seemed to close in around us. As we walked, The laughter faded and an unsettling silence took its place. The only sounds were the rustling leaves and the crunch of twigs underfoot. I felt a chill creeping down my spine, but I brushed it off as nerves. We were just being silly? Right. Suddenly, a loud noise shattered the stillness. It sounded like chains clanking together, echoing from somewhere deep in the woods. We froze, exchanging nervous glances. I could see the fear in Gina's eyes as she whispered that we should head back. But before we could turn around, we spotted something in the distance, a flickering light. It was moving, and with it came the unsettling sound of chains. We quickly ducked behind a tree, our hearts racing. The light got closer, revealing silhouettes of figures draped in dark clothing. They were carrying lanterns, their faces obscured by shadows. The clanking noise grew louder, and I felt my stomach drop. Who were they? Why were they out here? The figures stopped not far from us, standing in a huddle. They looked like they were chanting, their voices low and haunting. I couldn't make out the words, but there was something deeply unsettling about their tone. My hands trembled as I whispered to my friends that we should move away quietly. We slowly backed away, trying to remain as silent as possible. Just as we thought we were safe, one of the figures turned and pointed directly at us. I felt my breath catch in my throat. Their lantern light shone brightly, illuminating the space around us. It was like they could see us, even in the darkness. Panic surged through me, and I motioned for everyone to run. We took off down the path, the clanking of chains and chanting echoing behind us. We sprinted back to our campsite, our hearts pounding in our chests. We reached our tents, breathless and terrified. I glanced around, expecting to see the figures emerging from the shadows at any moment, but nothing came. We sat in a circle, trying to calm each other down, but the fear lingered like a thick fog. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we reluctantly decided to pack up and leave. I still felt shaken by what we had seen, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The sun cast a warm glow over the clearing, but it did little to ease my nerves. When we reached the spot where we had pitched our tents, I stopped in my tracks. The fire pit was still warm, but everything else was a mess. Our gear was scattered around, and deep scratches marred the surface of the ground, forming strange patterns. I approached cautiously, my heart racing as I noticed something strange in the dirt. There were words etched into the ground, barely visible but unmistakable. "We will find you." My blood ran cold as the memories of the night flooded back. We quickly gathered our things, the unease creeping back into our minds. We didn't speak as we loaded the car, all too aware that we had intruded into something we didn't understand. As we drove away, I glanced back at the woods, knowing that something dark lurked within those trees. We never went back. The experience remained an unspoken agreement between us, a secret too terrifying to share. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the distant clanking of chains in my mind, a chilling reminder of what we encountered in those woods. I can't help but wonder if the figures are still searching for us, waiting patiently in the shadows for their chance to make their presence known once more. The summer sun dipped low as we arrived at the campsite, a remote stretch of forest far from the buzz of civilization. I had always found solace in the woods, but something felt different this time. It was just me, Jenna, and Marcus' friends who were eager for a weekend of adventure, away from the constant hum of daily life. We set up our tents as the air cooled, and laughter filled the clearing as we roasted marshmallows by the fire. As darkness enveloped the forest, Jenna suggested we take a night hike. The idea sparked excitement, but I felt a twinge of hesitation. Still, the thrill of exploring the woods at night won out, and soon we were wandering deeper into the trees, flashlights cutting through the blackness. The forest was alive with sounds: crickets chirping, leaves rustling, the occasional hoot of an owl. It wasn't long before we stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin nestled among the trees. The wood was weathered and gray, and the windows were boarded up. Intrigued, we approached cautiously. Marcus, ever the brave one, nudged the door, and to our surprise, it creaked open. A wave of unease washed over me, but my curiosity urged me forward. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. The floor creaked beneath our feet, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Jenna shone her flashlight around the room, illuminating faded photographs on the walls, images of families smiling, their eyes hauntingly empty. A sense of dread settled over me. I wanted to leave, but I stayed, captivated by the strange energy that enveloped the cabin. We explored for a while, but as the shadows grew longer, we decided to head back to camp. That's when we heard it. A low, guttural growl echoed from deep in the woods. I froze, the sound crawling under my skin. It wasn't an animal, it was something else. Something menacing. We hurried back to the campsite, the fire crackling warmly as we huddled close. The growling had stopped, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I exchanged glances with Jenna and Marcus, silently acknowledging the unease that hung in the air. As the night wore on, I found it harder to shake the feeling of dread. I suggested we play a game to distract ourselves. We ended up telling ghost stories, our voices hushed as the tales grew darker. At one point, Marcus shared a legend he'd heard about a creature that roamed these woods, a spirit that took the form of a lost traveler, luring people into the forest never to return. Just as he finished, a loud crash echoed from the woods. My heart raced as we all jumped, flashlights flickering nervously in the direction of the sound. We strained to see, but the darkness swallowed everything. Then, suddenly, a figure emerged, illuminated briefly by our lights. It was a man, disheveled and wild-eyed, wearing tattered clothes. He stood at the edge of the clearing, staring at us with an unsettling intensity. His voice trembled as he spoke. "Help me, they're coming for me." We were frozen, the air thick with tension. I looked at Jenna and Marcus, both pale and wide-eyed. The man took a step closer, and in that moment, something shifted in the shadows behind him. More figures appeared, all with the same hollow eyes and tattered clothes. They emerged like wraiths from the darkness, their bodies flickering in and out of the light. Panic surged through me, and without thinking, we scrambled for the safety of the trees, hearts pounding in our chests. We ducked behind a large oak, breathless and terrified, as the figures advanced, their murmurs echoing through the night. I could feel the weight of their gaze, chilling and predatory. Then, just as we thought it couldn't get any worse, I heard a voice whispering my name from the depths of the woods. It sounded just like Jenna. My stomach dropped. The growls returned, closer now, mingling with the whispers. Realizing we were being lured into the forest, I grabbed Jenna's arm and pulled her back. "We have to go," I shouted. We ran blindly, adrenaline fueling our escape, not stopping until we burst into the clearing where our campfire flickered in the darkness. We made it back to the tents, shaking and terrified, convinced we'd escaped whatever haunted those woods. As dawn broke, we packed our belongings in silence, the shadows of the night still looming large in our minds. Just before we left, I glanced back at the cabin. Its presence felt like a dark secret. There was a flash of movement in one of the windows, a face peering out, grinning wide. I blinked, and it was gone. We jumped into the car and drove away, vowing never to return, but the memories of that night would haunt us forever. Little did we know, we weren't the first to escape those woods, and we certainly wouldn't be the last. Camping under a starlit sky always felt like an escape into another world, a raw kind of freedom you only get in nature. We were miles from any road, wrapped in the deep silence of the forest, only the crackling fire breaking the quiet. There were 3 of us, me, my friend, and his little brother. It was their first real camping trip, so I was the expert, having been camping a few times before. But something about this night was different. Even before we arrived, I felt a vague unease, an odd feeling of being watched from somewhere beyond the trees. As darkness crept in, the usual sounds of the forest seemed strangely muted. No chirping insects, no rustle of small animals in the brush. I tried to shake it off, chalking it up to nerves, and settled into a story, hoping to lighten the mood. As I spoke, though, I noticed my friend's brother staring into the woods, his face pale in the glow of the fire. He whispered that he saw something out there, just beyond the tree line. My friend and I laughed, teasing him about letting his imagination run wild, but the fear in his eyes didn't waver. Trying to calm him down, I aimed my flashlight at the spot he'd been staring at. For a second, everything looked normal. But as I panned the light along the edge of the trees, I caught a glimpse of something moving, a flash of white, slipping quickly out of sight. I froze, and so did my friends. My friend forced a chuckle, muttering about animals in the woods. "Probably a deer or a raccoon," he said. But something about the way it moved, it was too smooth, too deliberate, and it was silent. No crackling leaves, no snapping twigs, Nothing. We tried to laugh it off, throwing another log on the fire and talking louder than necessary, anything to shake the growing tension. But that feeling didn't go away, and the forest only seemed to get darker, more oppressive, about an hour later. As we sat by the fire, my friend's brother suddenly grabbed my arm, his nails digging into my skin. He didn't say anything, just pointed behind me, his eyes wide with terror. I turned slowly, my heart pounding, but saw nothing. Just trees and shadows. We tried to settle down, each of us lying down in our sleeping bags around the dying fire. But none of us could sleep. I could feel every sound, every faint rustle, and I sensed my friends lying awake too, tense and silent. Then I heard it a whisper. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but it grew louder, clearer, like it was right in my ear, though I was lying alone. It didn't make sense. The words were soft, unintelligible, like someone mumbling, just out of reach. I sat up, looking around, but I saw nothing. My friends were both wide-eyed, hearing it just as suddenly, the whispering stopped. We sat there, our breath shallow, when a loud crack echoed from the trees behind us, followed by what sounded like footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps, drawing closer. I shined my flashlight toward the sound, and my heart nearly stopped. There, at the edge of the light, stood a figure. It was pale, almost translucent, with long, thin limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally from its body. Its face was blank, almost featureless, but its eyes were wide open, unblinking, and staring straight at me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure tilted its head, as if it were studying us, before melting back into the darkness as silently as it had come. We didn't say a word, just packed up and left, stumbling through the dark, tripping over roots and rocks in our haste to escape. We kept moving until the first hint of dawn touched the sky, until we were far from that place. It was only later, when we had finally made it home and were safe within four walls, that my friend's brother spoke up, his voice barely a whisper. He told us he'd seen it, the same figure, in his room every night since we'd returned, just standing there, in the dark, watching him with those wide, unblinking eyes. It started as a simple weekend getaway with a few friends. We had all been craving a break from the city, so we decided to camp deep in the woods, far from any marked trails. No one had been there before, but the spot looked perfect on the map, secluded, peaceful, and surrounded by towering pines. We were ready for adventure. We arrived around noon, the forest alive with the sounds of birds and the rustling of leaves. Setting up camp took only a couple of hours, and by the time the sun began to set, the campfire crackled between us, casting long shadows on the ground. We joked around, ate, and made plans for a short hike the next morning. The air was crisp, and everything felt normal. Then, as night fell, the forest seemed to change. The wind picked up, and the trees began to groan. It wasn't a particularly unsettling sound, but it felt wrong, somehow, like the wind was trying to say something. I brushed it off, attributing it to the wilderness being what it is, alive, unpredictable. We huddled closer to the fire as it burned low, the darkness pressing in around us. It wasn't until the first strange sound that I started to feel uneasy. A loud crack, like something heavy snapping, echoed from the tree line. It wasn't a branch falling. It was too forceful, too deliberate. We all went silent, eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. There were no animals in the area that sounded like that, at least none we knew of, probably just a deer, someone suggested, though none of us believed it. A second crack followed, closer this time. We stayed quiet, listening. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something was out there. Maybe we should go to bed, I said, trying to sound calm. We'll hike in the morning. But no one moved. Everyone stayed stiff, eyes darting around, clearly unsettled. We decided to put out the fire early and retire to our tents, though none of us were eager to sleep. The wind howled through the trees, and as I lay in my sleeping bag, the sounds outside grew louder, more persistent. The scratching against the tent fabric started softly, like wind brushing over it, but then it intensified. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, like something or someone was pressing against the side of the tent. I sat up, heart racing. I wasn't sure what was more terrifying, the thought of an animal or the idea that someone was out there. I didn't want to check, but the scratching grew louder, more urgent. Finally, I couldn't take it. I unzipped the tent slowly, holding my breath. The beam from my flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees, shadows, and the twisted shapes of branches, but the scratching didn't stop. It continued, as if whatever was outside the tent was toying with me. Suddenly, I heard a voice, a soft, barely audible whisper. "Don't look." My blood ran cold. I slammed the tent shut and laid down again, trying to calm my frantic heart. The whisper repeated, louder this time, "Don't look." I sat frozen, my pulse pounding in my ears. I had no idea what was happening. The whisper sounded close, too close, like someone was standing right next to my tent. But when I dared to peek outside again, there was nothing. I wasn't the only one who had heard it. When I glanced over at the others, I saw they were awake, staring at me with wide eyes. No one spoke, but we all understood. Something was wrong. We decided to leave, pack up, and get out of there. As we gathered our things in the dark, the whispers returned, echoing through the trees. But this time, there was something more. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, approaching us from the tree line. I grabbed my pack and ran toward the path, my friends following behind me. We didn't stop until we reached the car. As we pulled out of the clearing and back onto the road, the whispers followed us, growing fainter as we drove farther away. It wasn't until we were nearly an hour away from the campsite that I glanced at my phone and noticed something strange. Several photos on my camera roll, taken during the night. I didn't recognize them. They were blurry, distorted, but one stood out, a picture of our campfire, with a shadowy figure standing just beyond the tree line. It wasn't one of us. The figure was tall and impossibly thin, its face obscured by the darkness, but its eyes, there were no eyes, just black sockets staring back. The worst part, the photo had been taken at the exact moment we'd heard the whisper. "Don't look." We'd survived the night, but whatever had been watching us, it was still there, waiting. It was a group of us, 5 friends from college, seeking a weekend of escape in the remote wilderness. None of us had ever camped in a place like this, far off the usual trails. Our phones had no signal, which only added to the appeal. The kind of place where you could unplug and truly be free. We had chosen a clearing by a small creek, surrounded by towering pines. The fire pit was already there, an old circle of stones, blackened by years of use. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the quiet was profound, like the world had forgotten us. As night fell, we settled around the campfire, cracking jokes and drinking beers. The flames danced and cracked, casting long, flickering shadows. I noticed it was unusually quiet, even for the woods. No owls hooting, no rustling of small animals in the brush, just the fire and the sound of the creek. It didn't seem right, but I shrugged it off. By around midnight, we were all in our tents. I was sharing with 2 others, and the others were spread out nearby. It wasn't cold yet, but the dampness in the air seeped in, making the inside of the tent feel heavier than it should. That's when I heard it. A faint scratching sound, like something lightly tapping against the canvas of our tent. I held my breath, trying to place it. Maybe it was an animal, a raccoon or a squirrel, but the scratching grew louder, more deliberate. I turned to my friends, but neither of them seemed to hear it. I glanced out the tiny window flap, but there was nothing, just blackness. I convinced myself it was just the wind. We were deep in the woods, after all, but then it came again, louder this time. A tap, 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 right near my ear. My heart thudded in my chest. I reached for the flashlight, shining it at the spot where the sound was coming from. Nothing. I wanted to call out to the others, but I didn't want to sound paranoid. I tried to lie still, hoping it would stop. But instead, the sound grew in intensity, as if whatever it was moving around the tent, circling it, tapping at every corner. My friends still didn't stir, and I wasn't sure if I should wake them up. I grabbed my pocket knife, feeling ridiculous, but protective, and I decided to step out and check the perimeter. The moment my foot touched the cold ground outside, the scratching stopped. A sudden, unnatural silence settled in. I scanned the trees. There was nothing, just the faint outline of the forest beyond the fire's glow. No eyes, no movement. I walked a few paces away from the tent, my flashlight casting long shadows. The silence was unbearable now. Every crackling branch, Every gust of wind made me jump. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Maybe an animal had gotten too curious, but as I turned to head back, something caught my eye in the distance. Near the edge of the clearing, half hidden by the trees, was a figure. It was too far to make out clearly, but it stood still, staring in our direction. I froze. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. I didn't wait. I rushed back to the tent, my heart racing. I woke my friends, and they looked at me with confusion, asking what was wrong. I tried to explain, but they dismissed it, laughing it off as an overactive imagination. Maybe it was just another camper passing through, but I knew what I had seen. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Something was out there. We sat around the fire for a while, talking about the strange feeling in the air, but eventually, we settled back into the tents. The sound of the creek, the rustling of leaves, everything felt wrong now. I didn't sleep much, half expecting that scratching to return, half hoping it wouldn't. Then, at 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of something far worse than scratching. It was a voice, whispering my name. I jerked upright, heart pounding. The voice was soft but clear, coming from the far side of the camp. I looked at my friends, but they were still asleep, breathing steadily. The beam landed on something that made my blood run cold. A figure standing in the firelight, dressed in rags, with eyes wide open and unblinking, staring straight at me. But the most chilling part was that the figure was holding a flashlight. My flashlight. I turned back to the camp. My friends were still asleep. I don't know how I got back to the tent, but somehow, I managed to crawl in and zip it shut. My hands shook as I held the flashlight, my mind racing. That thing, whoever it was, had been watching us, mimicking me. We packed up and left at first light. As we drove away, I glanced back at the clearing, now bathed in the early morning light. I didn't see anyone, but I'll never forget the sound of my voice, whispering from the woods. We had planned a camping trip for weeks, a group of 5 friends eager to escape the noise of our daily lives and spend a few days in the woods. It was supposed to be a simple getaway, some hiking, a little fishing, and long nights by the campfire telling stories. Nothing fancy, just the quiet of nature and the company of close friends. But that night, something changed. We arrived at the site just as the sun began to dip behind the trees. The camp was tucked away in a secluded corner of the forest, miles from the nearest town. The air felt fresh, almost unnervingly so, but we were used to that. After setting up the tents and starting the campfire, we cracked open some beers and settled in. We joked and laughed as the fire crackled, casting shadows that danced on the trees around us. As the night wore on, the forest grew still. The usual chirping of crickets and rustling of small creatures had fallen silent, replaced by an oppressive quiet. It was the kind of silence that crawls under your skin, making every little noise seem louder, sharper. I noticed it first, a small sound, barely perceptible, like something brushing against the leaves. I thought it was nothing at first, maybe a raccoon or a squirrel, but the others had caught it too. I looked over at my friend Max. He had his hand on his flashlight, his knuckles white. "Did you hear that?" he asked. We all froze, straining to listen. A branch snapped somewhere deep in the woods. Then nothing. A cold shiver crept down my spine. "Probably just an animal," Sarah said, trying to sound calm, but I could hear the tremor in her voice. She wasn't fooling anyone. We sat in uneasy silence, staring into the fire, every one of us too nervous to speak. Then came the first scream. It was high-pitched, not the kind of scream you hear when someone's hurt, but the kind that chills your blood. A distant scream, like a woman's voice. The sound carried through the trees and stopped abruptly. We jumped to our feet, hearts racing. Max was already reaching for his backpack, fumbling for the map, his face pale. "Maybe it's someone else camping out here," he said, though none of us believed him. That scream was too loud, too close. I whispered. My voice didn't sound like my own. It was thin, almost like I was trying to convince myself it wasn't real. Without thinking, we grabbed flashlights and headed toward the source of the sound. The trees were thick, and the shadows seemed to twist and shift unnaturally as we walked. Each step felt heavier, like the forest itself was resisting us. The scream came again, closer this time. A horrible, shrieking wail that tore through the air. We broke into a run, pushing through the underbrush, our breaths ragged, and then we saw it, a figure, hunched over by a tree, facing away from us. The shape was tall, unnaturally thin, its arms too long. It was scraping something on the ground, a slow, rhythmic motion that sent a fresh wave of dread through us. Double quotes hello. Max called out, his voice cracking. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. We took a step closer, the tension thick in the air. That's when the creature turned. Its face was hollow, its eyes wide and unblinking, black pits that seemed to suck in the light. A grin stretched across its face, impossibly wide, showing teeth that weren't just sharp, they were jagged, like they had been ripped from something not human. My stomach lurched. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Without warning, the thing opened its mouth and screamed again, this time so close it felt like it was inside my head. The scream was so loud, so pure in its terror, that it sent us stumbling backward. We turned and ran without looking back. The next few minutes were a blur of movement, fear, and adrenaline. We finally reached the camp, all of us panting, shaking, and covered in dirt. We didn't stop to think. We just threw ourselves into the tents, locking everything up as quickly as we could. The fire had burned low, the shadows growing longer and more ominous by the second. We huddled together, our breaths shallow, but the forest was silent again. Not a single sound. It wasn't until hours later, as we sat in our tents trying to recover from the shock, that I noticed something strange. Max had the map in his hands, staring at it with a puzzled look on his face. I leaned over, trying to see what he was looking at. There, on the map, was our campsite, but it was marked with an X, a circle around it, and a single word scrawled next to it. Dead. The air grew even colder. I could feel the blood drain from my face. The map had been in Max's backpack the entire time. We hadn't touched it since we set up camp. It shouldn't have been marked like that. We weren't alone. Not just in the forest. Somewhere, out there, in the trees, there was something else. Something that had been waiting. I'll never forget that night. It wasn't supposed to be anything special, just a simple hike with a couple of friends. We were looking for a secluded spot to camp, a place where we could escape the noise of the city and enjoy some peace. It wasn't even supposed to be an overnight trip, but that night changed everything. We started out in the late afternoon, taking a trail that had been described to us as off the beaten path by some locals. It was supposed to be an easy trek, just a few hours to a nice, quiet clearing by a stream where we could set up camp and spend the evening. The air was crisp, the sky still clear, and everything felt perfect, at least for the first couple of hours. As we made our way deeper into the woods, we noticed something strange. There was no sound, no birds, no rustling of small animals, nothing. I assumed it was just the stillness of the forest, but the longer we walked, the more unnerving it became. Even the wind had died down. The silence felt oppressive. It was the kind of silence that made your skin tingle and your senses go on high alert, as though something was watching you. We set up camp around dusk. A small fire crackled in the middle of the clearing, and we sat around it, trying to shake off the growing unease. We didn't talk much, which felt odd for a group of friends who usually couldn't stop chatting. The quiet was heavy. Then, we heard it, a voice. Soft and distant, but unmistakable. Help? It came from somewhere beyond the trees, just barely audible. At first, we thought it was a trick of the wind, but it was too clear, too real. We all froze. I looked around at my friends, trying to gauge their reactions. They were just as unnerved as I was. Did you hear that? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Yeah, one of them replied. What the hell was that? We all stood up, eyes darting around the campfire, trying to make sense of it. The voice came again, this time louder. Help me. The words were desperate, frantic, almost pleading. Without thinking, we grabbed our flashlights and started moving toward the source of the sound. I don't know why we didn't stop. It didn't make sense. It was dark, we were in the middle of nowhere, and the voice sounded wrong, almost like it was coming from something not human, but we went anyway. The woods around us grew darker the deeper we went, the trees closing in. The air became thick, the chill biting at our skin. We followed the voice for what felt like an eternity, but it never seemed to get any closer. It was as if we were chasing a ghost, the sound shifting and moving, just out of reach. Then, we found it. A small clearing, barely big enough for all of us to stand in. At the center of it was a pile of rocks, and on top of the rocks was a crude carving, a symbol I didn't recognize, something old and unsettling. The voice stopped. We all stood there, staring at the rocks, unsure of what to do next. The silence felt suffocating. Then, we heard it again. This time, it wasn't from the distance. It was right behind us. "Help me." The voice was now right next to me, close enough that I could feel the cold breath against my neck. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there, nothing but darkness. My friends were in the same state of panic, spinning in circles, their flashlights flickering wildly. We didn't know what to do. Every instinct told us to run, but the path back was already obscured by the shadows. That's when I noticed it, a shadow. A figure, standing just outside the circle of our lights, barely visible but unmistakable. I stepped toward it, my heart racing. The others shouted for me to stop, but I couldn't. I had to know what it was. I took another step forward, and the figure moved. It wasn't a person. It was a shape, a black silhouette. No distinct features, just an outline that seemed to shift with the light. And then, it spoke again, but this time, it wasn't a plea for help. "Leave." The voice was deep and unnatural, reverberating in my chest like a thunderclap. My friends screamed and pulled me back, dragging me away from the figure. We stumbled back through the trees, terrified and confused, not daring to look behind us. The forest seemed to open up before us, like the path had been waiting. When we made it back to the clearing where we had set up camp, the fire was out. The tents were gone, completely vanished. Everything was still, but not in the same way as before. It was a stillness that felt empty, like the forest had swallowed us whole and left nothing but the echo of our fear. I can't explain what happened. I don't know what we saw, or who or what had been calling us. But there's one thing I know for sure. The figure wasn't the thing we were supposed to fear. It wasn't the thing that wanted us to leave. It was the thing that wanted us to stay. When I was invited to stay at a friend's new place, I was excited. It was an old Victorian-style house, the kind you imagine in stories. They had recently moved in, and we were supposed to be spending the weekend there, unpacking and setting things up. I didn't think anything was unusual at first, just the charm of the house, the antique furniture, the large, dimly lit rooms. But as soon as night fell, things started to change. It wasn't obvious at first. We were in the living room playing cards and chatting. My friend's dog was curled up by the fireplace, and we were having a good time. That's when I heard it, a soft thud. It came from upstairs, where the bedrooms were. At first, I brushed it off, thinking it was the house settling or the dog moving. But then there was another thud, followed by a dragging sound. I looked at my friend, but they didn't seem to notice. "Did you hear that?" I asked, a little unsure of myself. "Hear what?" They replied, clearly distracted by the game. "I swear I heard something upstairs," I said, my voice quieter than I meant. They just waved it off, probably thinking it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house was too quiet, too still, and those noises, those dragging, faint sounds, they didn't sit right with me. Later, that night, around midnight, we were heading to bed. I took the guest room, which was at the far end of the hall. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it. The temperature dropped, and I could see my breath in the air, even though the house was warm. I brushed it off, thinking the room might be poorly insulated. I laid down, trying to fall asleep, but the house was too quiet. The kind of quiet that presses on your eardrums. I could hear my heartbeat, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen far below, and then more thuds. This time, they were louder. The floorboards creaked above me, followed by that dragging noise again. I shot up in bed. The dog had started barking downstairs, frantic and urgent. I didn't know what to do. I had always been skeptical about haunted house stories, but this felt different. There was something alive in that house, something that didn't belong. I grabbed my phone, prepared to text my friend, but before I could, the door to my room creaked open. I froze. I hadn't heard anyone walk down the hall. No footsteps, no sound of the door handle turning. But there it was, the door wide open, letting in only darkness. I didn't dare move. I couldn't. The dog's barking stopped abruptly. A heavy silence followed, thick and suffocating. I stared at the door, willing it to close, to end this feeling of being watched. Then, just as I thought I might be losing my mind, I heard it. A whisper, low and rasping, coming from the hall. "I'm here." It was a voice, but not a human one. It was too deep, too gravelly, like something trying to speak through the walls. I wanted to scream, but my body refused to move. I didn't dare look into the hallway, but I could feel whatever it was there, watching me. It wasn't just the house anymore, it was something else, something that had been waiting. I finally managed to get my legs under me, and I ran out of the room, down the hallway. I was panicking now, heart pounding in my chest. I banged on my friend's door. They opened it, half asleep, but I could see they were immediately shaken by my expression. "What's wrong?" they asked, looking around. "You need to get out," I whispered, trying to control my breathing. "There's something in the house." "I heard it, it's here." They looked at me, their face a mix of confusion and concern. But before they could respond, the dragging sound returned. It was louder now, closer. I turned toward the stairs, and there, standing at the top of the staircase, was the dog. But the dog wasn't barking. Its eyes were wide, pupils dilated. Its body was stiff, as if it had seen something it couldn't process. It was staring at something or someone that I couldn't see. I stepped back, and that's when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming down the stairs. Slow, deliberate, like someone was savoring the moment. The footsteps stopped at the bottom of the stairs. My friend and I stood frozen, not daring to make a sound. And then, just as the silence became unbearable, the dog turned and bolted toward the door. Without thinking, we followed. I didn't care about the rest of the house. I didn't care if we had to leave everything behind. I just had to get out. We made it to the car and drove off without looking back. When we finally stopped to catch our breath, I was shaking, my mind racing with what I had felt, what I had heard. But here's the part that still chills me to the bone. When I checked my phone, I saw I had a text from my friend. It had been sent hours earlier, while I was still in my room. It said simply, "You're not alone." Cabin in the woods, just me and a few friends. No distractions, no work, just nature. We had rented the place online, a secluded spot far from civilization. None of us were particularly into ghost stories. So when we arrived and saw how isolated the cabin was, it felt more peaceful than eerie. The cabin itself was charming, if a bit old. The walls creaked in places, but we didn't think much of it. The first night, after a few drinks and some laughter, we headed to bed, but sleep didn't come easily for me. The room was unnervingly quiet, except for the occasional gust of wind howling outside, and then scratch a faint noise from the other side of the cabin. I chalked it up to the wind or maybe an animal outside, but when the scratching sound continued, it became harder to ignore. It wasn't just random noise, it was deliberate, like something or someone was trying to get inside. I waited for my friends to make a joke about it. When no one did, I decided to get up and check. I crept down the hallway toward the front door, peering through the window at the darkness outside. Nothing. No movement. Just trees swaying under the moonlight. I sighed in relief and turned to head back to my room. That's when I heard a soft, desperate knock on the door. Knock. Knock. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct. I froze. Who would be knocking at this hour, especially in such a remote place? I moved slowly back toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't open it. I couldn't. I stood there, straining my ears for any sounds. There was nothing, no footsteps, no voices, just silence. I finally returned to my room, trying to ignore the nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. I locked the door behind me, pulled the blanket over my head, and tried to sleep. The next morning, I mentioned it to my friends, hoping they would laugh it off. But no one did. Instead, Sarah, one of the girls with us, said she heard something too. She described the same scratching sound I'd heard, but from the window. She had thought it was an animal at first, but the knocking she couldn't explain. We spent the day hiking through the woods, trying to clear our heads. It felt like the cabin was miles away from any other human being. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that something was watching us. That night, after dinner, we were all sitting around the fireplace, and the conversation turned toward local legends. Apparently, the area was known for being haunted, or so the locals claimed. One of my friends, Jake, started telling a story about a woman who had gone missing years ago, her last known location being just a few miles from the cabin. He described how people said they could hear her crying at night. I laughed it off. Ghost stories didn't scare me. Later that night, when we were all in our rooms, I heard the sound again, the unmistakable scratch on the wood. And then, once again, the knock. But this time, it wasn't on the door. It was on my window. I rushed to the window and pulled the curtain back, heart racing. Nothing, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I closed the curtains quickly, then heard it again. A whisper, faint but clear. Let me in. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My body was frozen in place. I glanced toward the door. Still locked. My room felt suffocating. The knock came again. Bang. Louder this time. It was coming from the front door. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran out of my room, down the hall to the living room, and yanked open the door. Nothing. No one was outside. Just the pitch-black darkness of the woods. My breath was coming in sharp gasps as I stood there, staring out into the void. I closed the door, leaning against it, trying to calm myself. And then, in the faint light of the hallway, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The doorknob was wet. A trail of dark smudges marked the wooden floor, leading from the door to the window of the living room. I followed the trail, every step feeling like it was pulling me into some kind of nightmare. I reached the window. There, smeared against the glass, was a handprint, and it wasn't small. It was large for a person. I backed away in terror, stumbling toward the door. But when I looked out into the woods again, I saw something. A figure, standing in the distance, just outside the boundary of the trees. It was watching us. It was always watching. I slammed the door shut and rushed to wake the others. But when I turned to tell them, they were all standing in the hallway, staring at me in silence. Their faces were pale, eyes wide with fear. It wasn't until I looked down that I realized the handprint wasn't on the window. It was on the back of my hand, and it was still wet. We packed up and left at once, leaving the cabin behind. But every time I close my eyes, I still see that figure in the distance. And the worst part, I know it followed us. We never should have left. We rented a cabin in the mountains, tucked away far from civilization. The plan was simple: a weekend to disconnect, drink some beer, hike, and enjoy each other's company. Nothing out of the ordinary, but from the moment we arrived, something felt wrong. It wasn't anything obvious at first. The cabin looked charming, old-fashioned but cozy, sitting quietly at the edge of a forest. But there was an eerie silence in the air. No birds, no animals, just the hum of the wind and the crunch of leaves beneath our boots as we unloaded the car. The first night was fine. We drank, joked, and set up a campfire. The woods were dark around us, but we didn't think much of it. By midnight, everyone had retreated to their rooms, and I found myself lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. The wind was louder now, rattling the windows. I rolled over, trying to ignore the noise. That's when I heard it, a soft, distinct knock. It wasn't coming from the door, it was coming from the window. Tap, tap, tap. I froze, unsure if I'd imagined it. I lay still, listening for more. It came again. Tap, tap, tap. My heart raced, and I tried to convince myself it was just a branch tapping against the glass. But then came another noise, more unsettling, a slow dragging sound, as if something heavy was being pulled across the ground outside. I shot up, my breath shallow. The knocking had stopped, but the dragging sound continued, moving around the cabin, as though something or someone was circling us. I didn't know what to do. My phone had no signal, and I was too scared to go outside to check. I lay there, paralyzed, listening to the sound grow louder, closer. It was almost like it was testing the perimeter of the cabin, making its way around to each window. Then, everything stopped. The cabin went completely silent, and for a few minutes, I convinced myself it had been my imagination. I drifted off to sleep, exhausted from the fear. The next morning, I didn't mention the sounds to my friends. We went hiking, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling from the night before. But the woods had an oppressive atmosphere, and I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. We made our way to a clearing, the sun barely breaking through the thick canopy above us. That's when I noticed something strange on the ground: footprints, but they were too big. The print was deep in the mud, almost like something heavy had stepped there, probably a bear, my friend Jake said, brushing it off. But something about it didn't sit right with me. We made our way back to the cabin, eager to relax after the hike. That's when I saw it. The window in the front room, the one I'd been so sure I'd locked last night, was wide open. I walked inside, my pulse quickening. We hadn't opened that window, and I definitely hadn't left it unlocked. I checked the others, but they were all fine. My heart raced as I walked into the living room. The furniture was in its usual place, but the air felt wrong. A chill ran down my spine. As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of the room, a dark shape standing just out of view, barely visible against the wall. My breath caught in my throat. I moved toward it, slowly, cautiously, but when I reached the spot, it was nothing. Just an old coat hanging on a hook. I let out a nervous laugh, shaking my head. I was letting my imagination run wild. But that night, the knocking came again. This time, I didn't wait. I grabbed my flashlight and rushed to the window. I looked out, my heart hammering in my chest, but saw nothing. No shadows, no figures, just the trees swaying in the wind. The knocking stopped. I wanted to forget about it. Maybe it was just the wind, or the cabin settling, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I didn't tell anyone else about it. We packed up the next day and left, but as we drove away, something caught my eye. Just outside the woods, near the cabin, was a figure standing motionless, watching us leave. I blinked, and when I looked back, it was gone. Weeks later, I found something online. A news article about the area we had stayed in, a missing person case from 20 years ago. A couple had gone missing while camping there, and their bodies were never found. The article included a photo of the couple, and the thing that chilled me to the bone wasn't the tragedy, it was their faces. They looked exactly like us. I haven't been able to shake the feeling that we weren't supposed to leave that cabin. And maybe, just maybe, whatever was out there in the woods, knocking on our windows, wasn't finished with us. I've always been the skeptic in the group. Ghosts, monsters, all that stuff, never bought into it. But what happened to me that weekend changed everything. I still can't explain it. A few friends and I rented a cabin in the woods for a weekend getaway. The kind of place you'd see in horror movies. Old, isolated, with trees crowding in all around. When we got there, the place was exactly as advertised: quiet, remote, perfect for getting away from the noise of the city. We unpacked, cracked open some beers, and spent the night swapping stories and playing cards. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. I mean, unnaturally quiet. No sounds of animals. No rustling of leaves, just silence. I didn't say anything at first. I chalked it up to being out in the middle of nowhere, but it felt off. That night, as we settled into our rooms, things started to get weird. I was in the downstairs bedroom, one of those with a single window that looked out into the woods. The others were upstairs, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't just a normal feeling of being watched. It was as if something was waiting for me. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a loud bang. It sounded like something hit the side of the cabin. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. The wind was howling outside, but it wasn't that, it was something else. Then came the soft scratching sound, like nails on the wood. It came from just outside my window. I lay there frozen, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or an animal. But the scratching continued, growing louder, more deliberate. I grabbed my phone, thinking maybe I could call someone, but the screen was blank. No signal. I had to check. I slowly got out of bed and tiptoed to the window, my heart racing. I peeked outside, but all I could see was darkness. No movement, no sign of anything that could have made the noise. I was about to turn away when I saw a shadow, just at the edge of the trees. It didn't move like a person, more like a cloud shifting unnaturally in the night. My stomach dropped. I quickly pulled away from the window and ran back to the bed, locking the door behind me. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, waiting. The next morning, I didn't say anything to my friends. I figured it was just a bad night, and maybe they'd think I was overreacting. But then one of them, Sam, mentioned something strange. I don't know. But last night, I thought I heard something tapping on my window, he said, looking around at us. I thought it was a branch at first, but it sounded like someone knocking. My blood ran cold. I wasn't the only one. That afternoon, we all decided to hike to the nearby creek to clear our heads. It was a peaceful walk, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was following us. Every time I turned around, the woods seemed to close in a little more. I told myself it was just my nerves, but the feeling stayed with me. We returned to the cabin later that day, and things felt off. The air felt thick, like we were being watched. We were sitting in the living room when we heard the sound of footsteps on the porch, slow and deliberate. We all froze. Sam stood up, walking to the door. It's probably just an animal, he said, but his voice was shaky. He opened the door. No one was there, but that wasn't the worst part. The door had been left ajar when we arrived. But now, the door was slightly pushed open. It was as if something or someone had been waiting for us to leave the room before making its move. We didn't stay much longer after that. We packed our things and left as quickly as we could. It wasn't until we were safely back in town that I thought to check my phone. Still no signal. But the real kicker came when I saw the pictures I'd taken earlier of the cabin. One of the photos was blurry, taken from the window of my room. In the background, just barely visible, was a face. A face peeking out from behind a tree, grinning, with eyes that didn't look human. To this day, I can't explain what happened. But I know one thing. Whatever was out there, it wasn't an animal. It was something else. Something that was waiting for us to leave so it could follow us. It's still out there. And I'm not sure if it's ever really going to leave. I'm not the type to believe in ghosts or any of that supernatural nonsense. I've always been a skeptic, especially when it comes to stories about creepy houses or strange occurrences. But that changed one weekend. My friends and I rented a house out in the woods for a getaway. The place was old, but charming, nestled in a clearing with towering trees surrounding it. We arrived late in the afternoon, the air crisp and cool, a perfect setting for a few days of escape. The house had this old-world charm-worn wooden floors, an overgrown garden, and creaking stairs that added to its character. That night, after dinner and drinks, we were all lounging around the living room. The fire crackled in the fireplace, casting flickering shadows across the room. It wasn't long before we started telling ghost stories, the usual stuff, spooky tales that only serve to make you laugh at how ridiculous they are. At least, that's what I thought. But then, Sarah, one of my friends, told us about the house's previous owner, an old woman who had lived there alone for years before passing away. People in the area said she had been eccentric, and some claimed to have seen strange lights in the windows at night. I didn't think much of it, just more campfire fodder. But something about the way Sarah described it gave me an odd feeling, like she wasn't telling the whole story. We all went to bed, but I couldn't shake the unease that crept in as I lay in my room, the wind howling outside. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but as I drifted off to sleep, I heard it, a soft tapping. At first, I thought it was just the wind, branches tapping against the window, but then it came again, gentle, deliberate, like someone knocking on the door. I bolted up right in bed, my heart racing. The tapping continued, slowly, methodically. I was frozen, too terrified to move. Was it one of my friends playing a prank? I tried to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. The sound was too close now, as if whoever or whatever was at the door was standing right outside. Then, a whisper, not a voice from inside the house, but from us beyond the door. It wasn't words, just a low, guttural sound, like someone breathing heavily. I must have stayed there, motionless, for what felt like hours, but eventually, the sound stopped. I was too scared to go back to sleep. So, us lay there in the dark, staring at the door. Eventually, the morning light filtered through the windows, and the house felt quieter, more ordinary. The next morning, I didn't mention what had happened. I assumed it was just my imagination. Maybe the wind had been stronger than I thought. But, as we were having breakfast, Sarah mentioned something odd. She said she had heard someone walking around outside her window in the middle of the night. I didn't say anything at first, but the others began sharing similar stories. Mark had heard a knock on his door. Emily had heard what sounded like footsteps on the stairs. We all chalked it up to nerves or old house creaks. But deep down, we all felt something wasn't quite right. That afternoon, we decided to go hiking through the woods, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. We stayed out for hours, but when we returned to the house, the mood had shifted. The air felt thicker, and the house felt colder, though the fire was still burning in the hearth. It wasn't until later, that evening, that we finally saw something that didn't make sense. The front door, which we had all double-checked before leaving, was wide open. None of us had opened it. We stood there, staring at the door, unsure what to do. Mark walked over to close it, and that's when we all saw it. At the foot of the door, barely visible in the dim light, was a single, muddy footprint. It was large, as if someone had been standing there, right outside. But no one had been outside the house when we were gone. The tension in the room was unbearable. We all stayed close together after that, too afraid to be alone. We heard no more tapping or whispers, but the air remained thick, oppressive. It was as if something or someone was watching us, waiting for the right moment. That night, after we had all retreated to our rooms, I heard it again. A knock, soft at first, then louder, more insistent. But this time, I wasn't alone. I heard it from the other rooms too. We all got up, too scared to sleep, and met in the hallway. We walked down the stairs together, our flashlights shaking in our hands. The knocking stopped when we reached the door. We all stood there, eyes wide, too scared to move. Then, slowly, the door creaked open on its own. I'll never forget the feeling of cold air rushing past us as we stared into the dark night beyond. And then, as if in response to our shock, we heard it a laugh, high-pitched and unsettling, echoing from the trees outside. It was the old woman's laugh. But no one was there, nothing was there. We left the house the next morning, never looking back. We rented the cabin to escape the stress of city life, 4 of us in total. It was deep in the woods, miles away from any kind of civilization. At first, everything seemed perfect. The cabin was rustic but cozy, surrounded by thick trees that made the outside world feel miles away. We spent the first evening around the fire pit, laughing and telling stories. As night settled in, the forest grew unnervingly quiet. I've always been sensitive to quiet places, but this felt different. There was something pressing on the air, something just under the surface of the normal sounds of nature. That night, I went to bed early. The others stayed up, but I felt exhausted. I tucked myself into the cozy bed and tried to drift off, but the silence was unsettling. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a noise. At first, it was faint, barely a whisper. A scratching sound like nails against wood. It was coming from somewhere inside the cabin. I lay perfectly still, thinking maybe it was just the house settling. But then the scratching came again, louder, closer. It was unmistakable, as if something or someone was moving just outside my door. I turned my head slowly, my breath shallow. The room was pitch black, and the only sound was the scraping against the wood. I held my breath and listened, but the noise stopped as suddenly as it had started. I lay there for what felt like forever, wondering if I should check it out. The rational part of my brain told me it was nothing, the wind, maybe, or an animal. But that voice in my head, the one that usually told me to calm down, was now silent. I couldn't take it anymore. I got up and crept to the door, holding my breath. I peeked through the crack. Nothing. The hallway was dark, but still. I opened the door fully and tiptoed out, my heart racing. The house felt colder now, like something had changed. The air seemed heavier. I walked toward the stairs, intending to check on my friends, but then I froze. At the bottom of the stairs, a shadow moved across the wall, its outline barely visible in the faint light from the living room. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The shadow grew clearer, and I saw something that made my stomach twist. It wasn't a person, it was something else. A figure, tall and unnaturally thin, moving slowly across the room. I backed away, but my foot caught on the edge of the floor. The figure stopped and turned toward me. For a split second, I thought I saw its face, a twisted, hollow thing, with black pits where I should be. And then, just as quickly, the figure vanished into thin air. I ran back to my room, slammed the door shut, and locked it. I pulled the blankets over my head and tried to calm my breathing. My mind raced with thoughts of what I had just seen. Had I imagined it? Was I just tired? The rest of the night was a blur. I couldn't sleep, couldn't even close my eyes. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside, sent me into a state of panic. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I was jolted awake again by a loud bang. This time, it came from downstairs, followed by muffled footsteps, as though someone was moving around the cabin. I didn't dare leave my room again. I texted my friends, but there was no reply. The silence from downstairs was almost worse than the noise. What was happening? What had been in that room with me? At dawn, I ventured downstairs, trying to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. But when I reached the bottom of the stairs, I stopped dead in my tracks. The living room was just as I had left it, except for one thing: the front door was wide open. I ran outside and looked around, my heart hammering. There was no one there, no sign of anyone having come or gone. The door was locked when we arrived, and I was certain none of us had opened it. When the others finally woke up, I told them what had happened. They thought I was just scared, maybe imagining things. But when we went outside later, we found something strange: deep scratches, like claw marks, along the front of the cabin, leading to the door. We didn't stay another night. As we left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching us, waiting for us to leave. The woods seemed darker now, more oppressive. I looked over my shoulder once more, but there was nothing there, just the trees, and the faint whisper of wind in the branches. I don't know what was in that cabin, but whatever it was, it wanted us to leave, and I'm sure it's still out there, waiting for the next people foolish enough to venture into the woods. I never thought I'd find myself in this situation, but here I am, sharing a story that still keeps me up at night. A few years ago, my friends and I rented a cabin for a weekend getaway. It wasn't an extravagant place, but it was tucked away in a secluded part of the forest, far from civilization. Perfect for a group of friends looking to disconnect. We arrived just as the sun was setting, the air crisp with the scent of pine. We settled in, made ourselves comfortable, and as evening fell, we gathered around the fireplace. It felt perfect, but things began to feel off. At first, I thought it was the isolation or maybe the silence that surrounded the cabin, but it was more than that. It felt like we were being watched. Around midnight, we decided to go to bed. The house grew quiet, save for the occasional creak of the old wood settling. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to push away the sense of unease that gnawed at me. It wasn't long before I heard something faint, at first, like soft tapping at my window. I convinced myself it was just the wind, the trees brushing against the house. But then it came again, louder. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, like someone or something was knocking at my window. I lay there, paralyzed, heart pounding in my chest. The knocks grew faster, then stopped. I didn't dare look out the window. Instead, I turned on my side, trying to ignore it, willing myself to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. I heard the sounds again, but this time they weren't from the window. It was at the door, slow, deliberate knocks, as if someone was waiting for me to answer. I sat up in bed, frozen, and listened. Then came the voice. "Let me in." It was faint, like a whisper carried by the wind. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't sure if it was real, but it felt like it was coming from right outside my door. My heart raced. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. The voice came again, this time more insistent. "Let me in." I finally worked up the courage to peek through the crack in the door, but there was nothing. No one. Just the dark, empty hallway. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. The next morning, I didn't mention anything to the others. They were all still sound asleep when I woke up, so I kept my nerves to myself. But as we sat around the breakfast table, one of my friends, Laura, spoke up. "I heard something weird last night," she said, her voice shaky. Like knocking at my window. It was like someone was outside. I thought I was just imagining it, but now I'm not sure. The others exchanged uneasy looks, but no one said much. I couldn't believe it. I wasn't the only one. Later that day, we decided to take a walk in the woods to clear our heads. We spent hours hiking, but the whole time I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It was the way the trees seemed to close in around us, the unnatural silence that seemed to follow us wherever we went. It wasn't normal. That evening, we sat around the fire again, trying to enjoy the night. But the strange feeling lingered, like an invisible presence watching us. When we went to bed, I tried to sleep, but my mind wouldn't quiet. I kept hearing things outside, the same tapping, the same whispering. It was like it was trying to get in. But what terrified me the most was when I heard someone whisper my name. It was clear as day. I jumped out of bed, heart hammering, and rushed to the window. There was nothing there. The woods were silent, unnervingly so. I wanted to leave, but I didn't want to alarm anyone. I couldn't explain it. I had to stay calm. The next morning, we packed up early. None of us spoke much, but there was an unspoken understanding. We were all on edge, and none of us wanted to stay another night. As we walked to the car, I glanced back at the cabin. That's when I saw at the front door. It was wide open. We had all locked it the night before. I didn't wait to investigate. We piled into the car and drove off in a hurry. But, as we left the woods behind, I noticed something strange in the rearview mirror, just for a second. A figure standing at the edge of the tree line, watching us. I don't know who or what it was, but I'll never forget the feeling. It was like we were being followed, watched by something that wasn't quite human. After that weekend, I tried to forget it. I told myself it was all in my head, just a trick of the mind. But when I looked at the photos we took during the trip, I saw something odd. In the background of one of the pictures, standing at the cabin's doorway, was a shadowy figure, just out of focus, and it wasn't any of us. To this day, I don't know what we encountered, but I know one thing for sure: whatever it wasn't human. It started as a normal evening. I was visiting an old friend who had recently moved into a big, creaky house on the edge of a dense forest. The place had a charm to it, but it also felt far too quiet, the kind of quiet that presses on your chest. My friend had invited a few of us over to help unpack, and by the time the sun sank, we were gathered in the living room surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, laughing and joking over pizza and drinks. The house had its quirks. The floorboards groaned with every step, and the plumbing let out strange, hollow knocks. We brushed it off at first. It was an old house after all, and old houses have personality. That's what my friend kept saying. As the night went on, we decided to explore the house more thoroughly. None of us had seen the attic yet, and in a house this old, the attic felt like a guaranteed treasure trove of weird history. The door to the attic was in the upstairs hallway, hidden behind an old pull-down ladder. The ladder creaked under our weight as we climbed up one by one. The air changed as soon as we stepped into the attic. It was colder, and the smell was heavier, like old wood and mildew. The attic was full of dusty boxes, cobweb-covered furniture, and stacks of yellowed newspapers. It looked like no one had touched the place in decades. We were rummaging through the boxes when we found something odd. It was an old photo album, but the photos inside weren't ordinary. They were black and white and showed a family, but their faces were strangely blurred. It wasn't from age or damage. It looked deliberate, as though someone had smeared their faces out before the pictures were taken. There were captions written in neat handwriting beneath each photo, but the ink had bled and run, making the words unreadable. That was when we heard it. A low, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere beneath us. At first, we thought it might be pipes again, but the sound was too deliberate. It was slow, steady, like someone knocking lightly on a wooden door. We stopped and stared at each other, unsure of what to do. My friend shrugged it off, saying it was probably just the house settling, but the rest of us weren't convinced. The tapping stopped, but something else caught my attention. In the far corner of the attic, there was a mirror leaning against the wall, its surface grimy and cracked. I don't know why I felt drawn to it, but I stepped closer. As I approached, I noticed something strange. The reflection didn't match what I was seeing. Behind me, I could see my friends standing in the attic, but in the mirror, they weren't moving. They stood frozen, their faces blank and staring directly at me. My stomach dropped. I turned around, and my friends were exactly as they should have been, laughing nervously and trying to decide whether to leave. I looked back at the mirror, and now the reflection was normal. I told myself my mind was playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. We decided to head back downstairs. As we climbed down the ladder, I was the last one to leave the attic. Just as I reached the bottom, I felt a cold hand brush against my ankle. I jumped, nearly falling, and turned to look. There was nothing there. My friends laughed nervously at my reaction, but I could see in their eyes that they were spooked. Back in the living room, we tried to distract ourselves with more jokes and stories, but the unease lingered. That's when the lights flickered and went out. The room was plunged into darkness. My heart raced as we fumbled for our phones and flashlights. The tapping sound returned, louder this time, and it wasn't coming from the walls or the floor. It was coming from the staircase. The beam of my flashlight caught the stairs, and what I saw made my blood turn to ice. There was a figure standing halfway down, its face pale and featureless, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. It didn't move, didn't react to the light. It just stood there, watching us, or at least I think it was watching. We froze, not daring to breathe. Then, without a sound, the figure turned and walked back up the stairs, disappearing into the shadows. We didn't stay to investigate. We grabbed our things and bolted out of the house, not stopping until we were outside in the safety of the night air. My friend moved out a week later after finding scratches on the attic walls and hearing whispers at night. To this day, I can't explain what we saw. I don't want to. All I know is that when I look in mirrors now, I can't help but wonder if the reflection I'm seeing is really mine. Most nights, I'm alone, keeping watch over the trails and ensuring everything's in order. I'm used to the quiet, the occasional howl of a coyote, and the rustle of leaves in the wind. But that night, well, it changed everything. It was just after dusk when I got the call. There was a report of something strange near one of the far-off campsites. A few campers had heard what they thought was someone moving around their tents, but when they checked, they found nothing. They weren't sure whether it was an animal or something else, but they were nervous enough to ask for assistance. Normally, I wouldn't have thought much of it. People get scared easily in the woods, especially at night. But something about the way the campers described it felt off. I grabbed my flashlight and keys, preparing to head out. My truck rattled down the gravel road, the only sound the tires crunching beneath. The deeper I drove into the park, the darker it became. I reached the campsite around 9 p.m., the last traces of sunset disappearing behind the trees. The campers had already packed up and left, their tents gone, the fire pit cold and abandoned. There was no sign of anything unusual, no footprints, no broken branches, just the empty space they had left behind. I walked around the area, scanning the ground, looking for anything out of place. It was dead silent, no animal sounds, no wind, just stillness. It felt wrong, like the air was too thick. Then I noticed something strange. One of the tents had been left behind, rolled up and tucked into the corner of the clearing. That wasn't right. The campers had said they left in a hurry. Why would they leave their gear behind? I approached it cautiously, my boots crunching the frost-covered ground. My flashlight swept over the tent, and I stopped cold. The zipper was halfway undone, and there was something inside, a bundle of clothes. I pulled back the flap, thinking maybe they had left it behind in the rush. That's when I felt it. A cold draft, like something had just exhaled against the back of my neck. The hairs on my arms stood up. Inside the tent was nothing but an old, faded blanket, twisted up in the shape of a person. But it didn't make sense. There were no footprints leading to or from the tent. No evidence anyone had been inside for hours. I stepped back, scanning the surrounding woods, my breath quickening. I was suddenly very aware of the darkness pressing in around me, of how alone I was. That's when I heard an unmistakable sound. The crunch of footsteps in the underbrush, faint but distinct. It was coming from behind me. I turned around fast, shining my flashlight toward the sound. There was nothing, only shadows and trees. I forced myself to stay calm, telling myself it was an animal, probably a deer, but the footsteps kept coming. I could hear them moving toward me, slow, deliberate. I could almost feel them, the way the air shifted, the brush being disturbed. Then, without warning, the footsteps stopped. My heart was hammering in my chest. I tried to steady my breath, but my legs were shaking. I couldn't move. I couldn't take my eyes off the trees. waiting for something to emerge. But nothing happened. No sound, no movement, just silence. I took one step forward, then another, trying to calm myself. I moved cautiously, back toward my truck, thinking maybe it was just a trick of the mind. But as I reached for the door handle, I froze. There was a sound coming from inside my truck. A faint scratching, like nails dragging along metal. I slowly turned to face the vehicle, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The sound grew louder, more frantic. I knew I couldn't go back inside the truck, not with whatever that was. I backed away, keeping my eyes on the vehicle, and that's when I noticed it, a figure standing at the edge of the trees. It was tall, unnaturally so, its limbs long and spindly, its body unnervingly still. I couldn't make out any features, but I felt its presence, like it was waiting for me to do something. I knew I had to get out of there. My legs were barely holding me up as I ran back to my truck, getting in as fast as I could. But the moment I slammed the door, the scratching stopped. The silence returned, but it wasn't comforting. It was suffocating. I sat in the truck for a few minutes, trying to process what had just happened. But it wasn't until I started the engine and looked out the windshield that my stomach dropped. The figure was standing in front of my truck now, its face inches from the glass. I couldn't see its eyes, but I felt them pressing into me, cold and empty. Then it smiled, a wide, unsettling grin, stretching impossibly far across its face. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished into the woods, disappearing into the night. I didn't stay to see what happened next. I left the park that night and never returned alone after dark. To this day, I still don't know what I saw. I've been a park ranger for nearly 6 years, and I thought I'd seen it all: storm damage, lost hikers, even some wildlife encounters that had me on edge. But nothing prepared me for that night. It started like any other shift, checking the park's trailheads and ensuring the campsites were properly maintained. The forest here is dense, old, and a bit eerie, but it's nothing I couldn't handle. I had just finished my rounds and was heading back to the station when my radio crackled to life. "Ranger, you there?" It was one of the other rangers, a younger guy named Thomas, who'd been working for less than a year. "Yeah, what's up?" I replied, adjusting the radio. "There's someone out here, just past the old ranger station on the Eastern Trail. I've been calling out, but I think they're ignoring me." I frowned. The area he mentioned was remote, and not many hikers ventured there. It was known for its overgrown paths and decaying structures, not the kind of place anyone would choose to be alone, especially as dusk was settling in. "I'll head over," I said. "Stay put until I get there." I drove my truck down the winding road, the sun barely hanging onto the horizon. The trees were thick, their trunks dark and twisted. As I approached the old ranger station, my headlights caught the faded, weathered sign. I slowed down, scanning the area with my high beams. There was no sign of Thomas. I parked the truck and stepped out, immediately feeling the cool, damp air that carried a strange stillness. The kind of stillness that makes you uncomfortable. I switched on my flashlight and began walking toward the station. I was still calling out for Thomas, but the deeper I went into the woods, the more the silence seemed to press in on me. I made it to the station and found it just as desolate as I remembered: dulled wood, crumbling brick, and broken windows. I shined the flashlight around the area, but saw no sign of anyone. Then, something caught my attention. A footprint, fresh and large, was embedded in the mud just outside the door. I froze. The ground had been soft from recent rain, and the footprint was unmistakable to clear to be from an animal, but too large to be a normal human print. My heartbeat quickened, but I pushed the thought out of my head. I needed to find Thomas. I walked through the station, my boots echoing in the hollow space. The air inside was damp, with a faint, musty smell. That's when I heard it. A rustling sound, like something moving in the next room. My hand went to the flashlight, and I flicked the beam toward the noise. Nothing. I stepped forward cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. But as I entered the next room, I froze in place. There, sitting in the far corner, was Thomas. He was facing the wall, unmoving, his head down. "Thomas," I called out softly, my voice shaking. I stepped closer, but he didn't respond. I felt a wave of unease wash over me, but I crouched down next to him, trying to get his attention. That's when I noticed that his skin was pale, to pale, and his eyes were wide open, unblinking, staring at the floor. But there was something wrong with his eyes. They were completely white, no pupils, just blank. I jerked back, suddenly terrified. Thomas, hey, what the hell is going on? His head slowly turned toward me, but it wasn't Thomas anymore. His mouth stretched unnaturally wide, the edges cracking, as though something inside him had torn. His lips pulled back, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too long. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat. My legs hit a piece of debris on the floor, sending a loud crack through the air. That was when the thing, whatever it was, lunged at me. I barely managed to roll out of the way, my heart slamming in my chest. The thing, it wasn't Thomas. It was something else entirely, mimicking him, using his body like a puppet. I scrambled to my feet, fear surging through me. The flashlight was still in my hand, but it had slipped from my grip, and now the light was weak, flickering. I bolted out of the station, not daring to look back. The forest seemed to close in around me, every branch and tree whispering in the wind. I ran faster, adrenaline coursing through my veins, but as I reached the truck, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I slammed the door shut and started the engine, peeling out of the station's lot. My hand shook on the wheel as I raced back to the main ranger station. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, my stomach twisted. There, standing in the road behind me, was Thomas, his blank white eyes staring right at me. The last thing I remember, before I drove away, was seeing that figure disappear into the darkness, vanishing as if it had never been there at all. I don't know who or what I saw that night, but the Rangers all agreed. Thomas had left the station hours ago, and there was no way he could have made it out there before me. That thing, whatever it was, had been waiting for me. A few friends and I packed our tents, sleeping bags, and a few essentials, and hiked deep into a forest that was far from any well-traveled trails. The sun was just beginning to dip below the trees when we set up camp in a clearing. The air smelled of fresh pine, and the sound of birds and rustling leaves filled the space around us. As we got the fire going, everything felt right. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow down, where worries disappeared. By nightfall, we sat around the fire, roasting marshmallows and chatting. The forest felt alive with the sounds of night creatures, but there was an eerie stillness in the air, like something was watching us. I brushed it off as nothing more than my imagination, but I wasn't the only one who noticed it. My friend Sarah was staring into the woods, her face pale. "What's wrong?" I asked, half joking. She shook her head. "I don't know. It just feels strange." I laughed it off. "It's just the forest. You're fine." We all tried to brush it off, but none of us felt entirely at ease. As the fire burned low, we decided to call it a night and crawl into our tents. I was the last one to settle in, zip my tent shut, and lie down, trying to push the nagging feeling away. It wasn't long before I heard the first noise. It was faint, like something brushing against the canvas of my tent. I froze, listening intently. Nothing. The wind. Probably, but then it came again, this time louder. Something was scraping along the side of my tent. I gripped the flashlight by my side, trying not to make a sound. I knew we weren't in bear country, and the thought of a person outside my tent sent a cold shiver down my spine. The noise came again. It was deliberate, slow, not an animal. My breath caught in my throat as the sound of something footsteps crunched in the leaves just outside. I stayed perfectly still, barely daring to breathe. The rustling got closer, right by my head. Then there was a whisper. "Don't open the door." I felt my heart skip a beat. The voice was clear, as if someone was standing right outside. It wasn't one of my friends. I knew that. I reached for the zipper of my tent, my hand trembling, and pulled it open just enough to slip the flashlight through. Nothing. The clearing was empty. I stared out into the darkness, my eyes scanning the trees, but there was no one. I felt like I was losing my mind. "Sarah," I whispered, not wanting to wake the others. "You okay?" The voice answered, distant but loud enough to hear. "Don't open the door, please." I froze, feeling my blood run cold. That wasn't Sarah. That wasn't anyone I knew. I reached for my phone. Dead. I couldn't even text anyone. Panic gripped me as the voice came again. This time it was more insistent, urgent. You're not alone. I unzipped the tent all the way this time and stepped out, shining the flashlight into the darkness. The trees loomed like dark sentinels, shadows flickering in the light. My pulse was racing, and I was on edge, every noise amplifying in my ears. Suddenly, a figure darted across the firelight. I snapped the beam of the flashlight in that direction. Nothing, just the wind, or it be a raccoon. I turned back to the fire pit, where my friends were still sleeping soundly. I wanted to wake them, but something stopped me. I couldn't explain it. My mind screamed at me to wake them up, but I stayed frozen. Something wasn't right. I could feel the oppressive weight of something just beyond the trees. I sat back down on the log, trying to calm myself. Then, a loud crack split the night air. It came from behind me, and I whipped around, shining the light in that direction. There, standing just beyond the ring of firelight, was a tall, thin figure. My breath caught in my throat, my hand shaking as I lifted the flashlight. But when I looked again, it was gone. I stood up slowly, heart pounding in my chest. That's when I saw the unmistakable outline of something in the darkness. It wasn't moving, but it was watching us. I backed toward the tent, every muscle tense. The figure remained where it was, standing perfectly still, just outside the firelight. I rushed into the tent and zipped it up, feeling the cold sweat on my neck. The voice came again, softer this time, almost like a whisper in the wind. You should have left when you had the chance. We packed up in a hurry the next morning, our nerves shattered. As we hiked back toward the trailhead, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us. I glanced over my shoulder several times, but there was nothing. Weeks later, I went through the pictures on my camera. There was one I didn't remember taking a blurry shot of the forest, with what looked like a figure standing far behind the trees. But what made my skin crawl was the face I could barely make out in the dark. The face wasn't human. It was watching me. We decided to go camping to escape the bustle of city life, a group of 5 friends eager for adventure. We drove deep into the woods, far from the beaten path, excited about the quiet and the stars. Our destination was a secluded clearing near a lake, surrounded by towering pines. The sun dipped behind the trees as we set up camp, and we roasted marshmallows by the fire, telling stories that blended laughter and nervous tension. As night fell, the forest transformed. Shadows deepened, and the sounds of the night came alive: the rustling leaves, distant calls of owls, and the soft croak of frogs from the lake. In the back of my mind, something nagged at me, an unshakable feeling that we weren't alone. I shrugged it off, laughing at my own paranoia. After a few hours, Yena, one of our friends, suggested we take a night walk. She claimed it would be fun, and surprisingly, everyone agreed. Armed with flashlights, we ventured into the woods, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. The air felt thick, the silence unsettling. Every crunch of twigs beneath our feet echoed like a warning. We wandered deeper until we stumbled upon an old, abandoned campsite. The remains of a fire pit lay overgrown with weeds, and torn bits of fabric flapped eerily in the wind. The chill in the air intensified as we approached. Yena shone her light on the remnants, revealing a rusted can and some tattered ropes. Suddenly, we heard a distant sound like chains dragging across the ground. Our laughter died in our throats as we exchanged glances, confusion and fear mingling in the flickering light. It wasn't just our imaginations. The sound was real and getting closer. Without a word, we turned to run back to our camp, but before we could take more than a few steps, the clanking stopped. We froze, hearts pounding, listening intently. In the distance, faint lights flickered through the trees. They danced and swayed like lanterns, growing brighter and larger. Fear gripped us, and we ducked behind a thick cluster of bushes. I peered through the branches, holding my breath. What emerged from the shadows sent a chill through my spine. Figures clad in white robes shuffled toward us, their faces obscured by masks. Each carried a lantern that illuminated their chains, which rattled with each step. I could see at least 5 of them moving in an eerie procession, their muffled whispers merging with the rustle of leaves. I felt a surge of terror. We needed to stay hidden. The figures paused for a moment, and I could hear their whispered chants, something unintelligible that made the hair on my neck stand on end. My friends and I huddled together, eyes wide with fear. We waited, our hearts racing, praying they wouldn't spot us. The lanterns cast grotesque shadows that flickered and danced, making the scene feel even more surreal. Just when I thought the nightmare might end, one of the figures turned its head slightly, and my breath caught in my throat. The mask seemed to look directly at me. In a panic, we stayed as still as possible, hardly daring to breathe. The figures resumed their slow march, the lights fading into the darkness until they disappeared entirely. We waited a few more minutes before deciding we had to get back to the camp and leave. As we crept back to our campsite, an uneasy silence fell over us. But what we found made my blood run cold. Our campsite had been ransacked. Tents were torn open, and our supplies were scattered across the ground. In the center of the chaos was a newly lit fire, and beside it was a wooden sign we had never seen before. The sign bore a single phrase carved deeply into the wood: "You shouldn't have come here." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. We hurriedly gathered our things, adrenaline coursing through our veins as we looked over our shoulders. We had to leave. Now, we jumped into the car, frantic, and drove away from the woods, leaving the flickering light of our ruined campsite behind. We vowed never to return, but even now, as I sit at home, the memory haunts me. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the faint sound of chains in my dreams. Those masked figures still lurk in my mind, and I can't shake the feeling that they are still out there, waiting for the next group of campers to wander too far into their territory. It was supposed to be a fun camping trip with my friends. We drove to a secluded area, far from the noise of the city, hoping to escape the pressures of our everyday lives. There were 5 of us, my friends Jake, Sarah, Lily, and Mark. We pitched our tents under the trees, the sound of the crackling fire providing a comforting backdrop to our laughter. As night fell, the woods transformed, the shadows deepened, and the familiar sounds of the forest turned ominous. I suggested we tell ghost stories, thinking it would be a laugh. But as we shared tales of lost souls and wandering spirits, I could feel an unsettling chill creeping in. Jokingly, Jake dared us to go for a midnight hike to explore the woods. With flashlights in hand, we ventured into the darkness. The moonlight barely pierced the dense canopy, and every rustle in the underbrush made my heart race. As we walked deeper, I noticed that the atmosphere had shifted. The air felt thick, heavy, as if the forest itself was watching us. I dismissed the feeling as paranoia, but something about the stillness made me uneasy. That's when we heard a low, mournful howl echoing through the trees. We stopped in our tracks, exchanging nervous glances. Was it a wolf? The sound sent a shiver down my spine. We decided to press on, hoping to laugh it off once we were back at camp. But the deeper we went, the more unsettling it became. The howling returned, closer this time, accompanied by a faint rustling. Suddenly, Mark, who had been trailing behind, screamed. We turned to see him pointing toward a figure emerging from the shadows. It was a tall silhouette, swaying slightly, its outline obscured by the darkness. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to make out any details. I felt paralyzed, fear gripping me like a vice. "Is that a person?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Before anyone could respond, the figure lurched forward. Panic erupted among us. We turned to run, but my foot snagged on a root, and I fell hard to the ground. My flashlight flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. I scrambled to my feet, heart racing, and stumbled after my friends. We burst back into the clearing, breathless and shaken. I quickly checked to see if everyone was okay. Mark was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "What was that thing?" he gasped. "I don't know, but we should pack up and leave," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We hurriedly gathered our things, our earlier bravado completely forgotten. As we worked, the haunting howl rang out again, echoing in the distance. It felt like the forest itself was alive, mocking our fear. With our gear hastily stuffed into backpacks, we turned to leave when Jake suddenly froze, his eyes wide. "The fire," he said, pointing. The flames had flared up unexpectedly, casting eerie shadows across the clearing. We had extinguished it before heading into the woods, but now it blazed brighter than ever, illuminating the trees around us. "What the hell?" Lily exclaimed. I felt a cold sweat break out as I realized something was off. The firelight revealed a pattern in the dirt around it, something we hadn't seen before. Scratches and markings that seemed deliberate. almost ritualistic. It looked like words, but twisted, as if they had been clawed into the ground. "Get away from the fire," I yelled, panic rising again. We stumbled backward, eyes locked on the flames. The howls returned, but now they were accompanied by a rustling sound, like branches snapping. Shadows danced wildly around us, the flames illuminating the silhouettes of figures hiding just outside the light's reach. We were trapped. Then, just as we were about to bolt, the fire suddenly died down to embers, plunging us into darkness once more. The figures became clear, now dozens of them, watching silently from the tree line, their faces obscured by the night. In a flash, I recalled a story I had heard years ago, about a camping group that vanished without a trace, the only clue being markings found in the dirt. They had been lured into the woods by the firelight, just like we had been. In that moment, we understood. We weren't just in a haunted forest. We were part of a sinister game, and we had unknowingly walked into their territory. With adrenaline pumping, we bolted toward the path that led back to our car. As we ran, I could hear their footsteps behind us, almost mocking. I glanced back one last time and saw them emerging from the shadows, eyes glinting like hungry predators. We reached the car, breathless and terrified, and peeled away from the campsite, leaving behind the twisted horror of the woods. The last thing I saw in the rearview mirror was a figure standing by the dying embers, watching us leave, and I knew it wouldn't be the last time I felt their presence. When I was younger, I spent many weekends camping with friends in the woods. This one particular trip was planned to celebrate the end of summer, just before school started. It was me, my cousin Emily, and our two friends, Jake and Sarah. We set up camp in a remote area, far from the busy trails and the noise of the city. The trees were tall and the air smelled of pine, a crispness that reminded us of adventure. After setting up our tents, we gathered around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling ghost stories as dusk turned to night. Sarah had brought her guitar, and we strummed out tunes under a star-filled sky. As the night deepened, I felt a strange energy in the air, almost electric, but I shrugged it off as excitement. As the fire crackled, Emily suggested a night hike. The woods were dark and inviting, and fueled by our earlier stories, we decided to go for it. We grabbed our flashlights and made our way into the forest. The moment we stepped off the clearing, the sounds of the night enveloped us. The chirping of crickets was punctuated by the rustle of leaves, a haunting symphony that was both thrilling and unnerving. We walked for what felt like an hour, chatting and laughing, when suddenly a loud rustling came from the bushes nearby. It sounded almost like a growl. The laughter died instantly, replaced by a heavy silence. We exchanged nervous glances, each of us wondering if we should turn back. Jake, always the brave one, insisted it was probably just a deer. So, we pressed on. As we moved deeper into the woods, we noticed something odd. The trees seemed to close in around us, blocking the moonlight and casting eerie shadows that danced just beyond our line of sight. Then came the sound again. This time it was closer and more pronounced, a scraping noise like nails against wood. My heart raced, but curiosity pushed us forward. Just then, we stumbled into a small clearing, illuminated by our flashlights. There, we found an old, dilapidated cabin, its windows shattered and door hanging off its hinges. It looked abandoned, yet there was a strange feeling that we weren't alone. Despite the unease creeping over us, we approached the cabin, driven by adrenaline and the need for exploration. As we neared the door, I noticed something glimmering in the dirt. I knelt down to inspect it and gasped. It was a small, rusty key. I turned it over in my hand, feeling the weight of its history. My friends gathered around, intrigued. We decided to look inside, the thrill of discovery overshadowing our instincts to leave. With some effort, we pushed the door open, and it creaked loudly, the sound echoing in the night. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. Cobwebs hung in every corner, and the floorboards groaned beneath our feet. As we explored, Sarah suddenly screamed, pointing to the wall. There were strange symbols carved into the wood. Some looked like faces, others like claws reaching out. We stepped back, our hearts racing. Then, without warning, the cabin door slammed shut behind us. We jumped, panic surging as we rushed to the door, but it wouldn't budge. The air grew cold, and a feeling of dread settled in our stomachs. Then, we heard the sound of footsteps outside. slow and deliberate, moving around the cabin. Jake pushed against the door with all his might, and just as it started to budge, the footsteps stopped. We held our breath, the silence almost deafening. We decided to stay quiet, hoping whatever was out there would leave us alone. But then came a low whisper, so soft we could barely hear it. It was unintelligible, but laced with malice, sending chills down my spine. The door rattled as something pressed against it from the outside. Emily, shaking with fear, urged us to find a window. We all scrambled to the nearest one, fumbling with the broken glass, desperate to escape. But before we could get it open, the whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices urging us to listen. Suddenly, the key I had found began to glow in my hand. I glanced at my friends, confusion etched on their faces. Without thinking, I ran back to the door, inserting the key into the lock. To my shock, it turned smoothly, and the door swung open as if inviting us to flee. We stumbled out into the night, gasping for air, the sounds of whispers fading behind us. We ran back to our camp, our hearts pounding, not daring to look back. When we finally reached the safety of the fire, we collapsed in a heap, shaking with adrenaline and fear. But the night was not over. As we settled down, I noticed the key still clutched in my hand. My stomach dropped as I realized the symbols I had seen in the cabin were now etched into my skin, forming a pattern on my wrist that burned like a brand. We were never meant to leave that cabin, and I could feel something watching us from the darkness, waiting for its time. We were excited for our weekend camping trip, the four of us eager to escape the grind of everyday life. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, we arrived at our chosen spot. The site was remote, surrounded by dense woods that promised solitude and adventure. We set up our tents, made a campfire, and cooked hot dogs while sharing stories of past trips, laughing under the stars. As night enveloped the forest, a chill set in. We huddled closer to the fire, and Yana, always the jokester, suggested we play a game. She proposed truth or scare, a twist on the classic game. Each person had to tell a scary story or share a truth that no one else knew. It was all in good fun until it was my turn. With the fire crackling and shadows dancing around us, I began to tell the tale of a local legend, an old park ranger who vanished in the woods decades ago. They say he was searching for something he never found, and on moonless nights, you can still hear his chains rattling as he roams, looking for anyone who dares to camp in his territory. As I spoke, I noticed a flicker of unease in my friend's eyes, but I brushed it off, attributing it to the spooky atmosphere. After my story, we decided to take a short hike before bed. The darkness pressed in around us, the trees towering like silent sentinels. We laughed nervously, trying to keep the mood light, but the deeper we ventured into the woods, the more the sounds of nature seemed to fade. It was eerily quiet, and I felt a knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. Suddenly, from somewhere in the darkness, we heard a distinct clanking sound, like metal against metal. My heart raced as we stopped in our tracks, exchanging worried glances. It echoed through the trees, louder now, like chains being dragged across the ground. Gina's face turned pale, and I could see her grip tightening around the flashlight she held. "Let's get back to camp," I suggested, trying to sound calm. We turned to retrace our steps, but the clanking grew louder, more frantic. Panic surged through us, and we broke into a sprint, the beam of our flashlights bobbing erratically as we stumbled through the underbrush. I could hear my friends gasping behind me, their breaths coming in quick bursts. Then we saw lights, flickering in the distance, moving slowly toward us through the trees. They were lanterns, glowing eerily in the dark. My instinct screamed to run, but curiosity held me in place for a moment too long. I wanted to see what was coming. The lanterns approached, revealing figures shrouded in shadows, their faces obscured by dark hoods. "Hide," I shouted, and we dove into the nearest thicket, hearts pounding in our chests. We crouched low, the clanking chains now deafening. Through the gaps in the bushes, we watched as the figures moved closer, each one carrying a lantern that illuminated their strange, unnatural movements. I felt a cold sweat trickle down my back. They walked in a slow, deliberate line, each step synchronized, and I could see that they were bound together by chains. My blood ran cold as the realization hit me these weren't just people. They looked like some kind of ghostly procession. As they passed, I caught a glimpse of their faces, hidden behind the hoods but pale and sunken, as if they had emerged from a grave. Then, suddenly, they stopped. One of them turned, their lantern light sweeping across the bushes where we hid. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if sensing our presence, and then continued on, the group moving as one again. We waited, terrified and breathless, until the sounds faded into the distance. When we finally emerged from our hiding place, dawn was breaking, casting a pale light through the trees. We hurried back to camp, shaken but relieved to find our tents untouched. But as we approached, a chilling sight awaited us. The fire pit was cold, the ashes scattered, and next to it, scratched into the dirt, were the words "You should have stayed" hidden. In that moment, a wave of terror washed over us. We packed our things in silence, hearts racing, and bolted for the car, vowing never to return. As we drove away, I glanced back at the woods, and for a brief second, I could have sworn I saw the same figures standing among the trees, their lanterns flickering like dying stars. As a park ranger, I had grown accustomed to the eerie stillness of the woods. It was mid-October, and the vibrant autumn leaves painted the landscape in fiery reds and oranges. Most visitors had left, leaving the park in a haunting solitude that felt almost alive. I was patrolling the area when I received a call over the radio. A family had reported hearing strange noises outside their tent, something that sounded large and menacing. I set out on foot, a flashlight in hand, my heart racing. The night air was thick with tension, and the shadows loomed ominously among the trees. The path to the campsite felt longer than usual, each snap of a twig underfoot echoing in the stillness. The family had set up camp deep in the woods, far away from the main trails. As I approached, I noticed an unusual quiet, the kind of silence that seems to hold its breath. When I reached their campsite, the tension in the air became palpable. The tent was unzipped but empty, their belongings strewn about haphazardly. My gut twisted as I called out for them. No response. I stepped inside the tent, my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. Everything appeared untouched, but the unsettling absence of the family gnawed at me. I heard it then, a low growl that sent chills down my spine. I stumbled back outside, scanning the perimeter. My heart raced as I noticed fresh claw marks on the ground, deep and jagged, surrounding the tent. I cursed under my breath, my instinct screaming that something was very wrong. I should have turned back then, but my ranger training kicked in. I had to find them. I ventured deeper into the woods, calling out for the family. The growl reverberated through the trees again, closer this time. It was guttural, a sound that belonged to something primal. Suddenly, a figure darted through the trees, its movement too swift for a human. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, I caught a glimpse of a tall, lanky silhouette with glowing eyes. Panic surged through me as I stumbled backward, the darkness swallowing my light. I turned and ran, branches scratching at my arms as I darted through the underbrush. I heard it behind me, its growl morphing into a harsh cackle that pierced the night. I pushed myself harder, adrenaline pumping through my veins, desperate to escape whatever hunted me. Finally, I burst onto a familiar trail, breathless and disoriented. I fumbled for my radio, calling for backup, my voice a frantic whisper in the static. I didn't want to admit how scared I was, but fear clawed at my insides. As I waited, I could hear the rustling in the bushes, that low growl echoing closer. I turned, prepared to face whatever came next. Moments later, another ranger arrived, flashlight beaming into the dark. Relief washed over me, but I quickly warned him of the creature. We gathered our courage and approached the family's campsite, but the creature was gone. The only signs of disturbance were the deep claw marks and the ransacked tent. Then we heard its screams coming from deeper in the woods. My stomach twisted as we sprinted toward the sound, hearts pounding. What if we were too late? As we reached a clearing, we saw the family huddled together, terrified but unharmed. The relief was overwhelming until I turned to see what they were pointing at. In the center of the clearing stood the creature, its long limbs twitching and contorting in unnatural ways. But then I realized something horrifying. The creature was mimicking the father's voice. "Help me," it called, but the tone was twisted, dripping with malice. It wasn't just a monster. It was a horrifying imitation, feeding on their fear. In that moment, Everything clicked. The growls were not of a beast, but of a being capable of deception. It fed on the fear of its prey, luring them into the darkness. We backed away slowly, not daring to turn our backs on it, the family still frozen in shock. My heart raced as I realized our only chance was to leave this clearing. We moved together, inching backward until we were out of its reach. The creature screeched in frustration, the sound echoing through the trees. I grabbed the family's arms, urging them to run. The woods felt alive with danger as we raced back to safety, knowing we had escaped a fate worse than we could imagine. As we reached the edge of the park, I glanced back at the dark woods, knowing the true horror had only just begun. The night had settled in the forest like a heavy blanket, and as a park ranger, I was used to the eerie calm that enveloped the woods after sunset. The campgrounds were closed for the season, but I had to make my rounds to ensure no one had sneaked in for an illicit camping trip. The air was crisp, and the silence was almost deafening. My flashlight cut through the dark, illuminating the twisted branches and underbrush. About an hour into my patrol, I noticed something unusual: a tent set up deep in the woods, far from the designated camping area. My heart raced. The site was supposed to be closed for the season, and no one should be there. I approached cautiously, my footsteps muffled by the thick layer of fallen leaves. As I got closer, I could see the tent was unzipped but empty. The campfire pit lay cold and dark, a few charred logs scattered around. I scanned the area, calling out if anyone was there, but only the wind answered. I was about to turn back when I noticed a backpack near the tent, half open, and inside, I caught a glimpse of a child's drawing. It was crude but depicted a family camping. My gut twisted. Suddenly, a sound pierced the silence: laughter. Distant yet unmistakable, it echoed through the trees, high-pitched and childish. I turned, flashlight beam sweeping the darkness. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Children shouldn't be out here alone, especially in the dead of night. I made my way toward the sound, heart pounding. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the laughter faded, replaced by a chilling stillness. Then, I heard something else: a low growl. Unlike anything I had heard before, it sent a bolt of fear through me. I raised my flashlight higher, trying to see beyond the trees, but nothing moved. I hesitated, trying to rationalize the noise, convincing myself it was just an animal. With a deep breath, I continued, hoping to find the children and bring them back to safety. I stumbled into a small clearing and spotted something that made my blood run cold. There, among the foliage, stood a tall figure, its back turned to me. It wore what appeared to be a tattered, oversized sweater, the hem dragging along the ground. I called out, but it didn't move. Instead, it seemed to shift slightly, as if sensing my presence. I felt the air grow heavier, and a chill swept over me. My instinct screamed to run, but I couldn't leave without understanding what was happening. I took a cautious step forward, and the figure suddenly turned around. My flashlight flickered against its face, a twisted, unsettling mask that was neither human nor animal. Its eyes were sunken and empty, and it opened its mouth to let out a haunting sound that mimicked laughter. The growl I heard earlier grew louder, but I realized it wasn't coming from the figure. Panic surged through me as I turned to flee, heart racing. I crashed through the underbrush, branches snagging at my clothes. I sprinted back toward the path, but the laughter followed me, echoing through the trees, getting louder with each step. As I emerged onto the main trail, gasping for breath, I nearly collided with a family of 3 parents and a young child, their eyes wide with confusion. They must have arrived just as I was fleeing. I hurriedly explained what I had seen: the laughter, the figure. They listened, faces pale and frightened, but before I could convince them to leave, the laughter echoed again, louder this time, and the figure emerged from the tree line behind them. I shouted for them to run, and they turned in terror. The family sprinted down the path as I grabbed my radio, frantically calling for backup. I didn't look back until I reached the main ranger station, heart pounding. When the other rangers arrived, we formed a search party, but the woods were silent. We combed the area, but there was no sign of the figure, the tent, or the family I had seen. Hours passed with no trace, and as dawn broke, the sun illuminated the woods with a haunting beauty. Later, as we gathered to regroup, I heard the same high-pitched laughter wafting through the trees. sending chills down my spine. I turned to my fellow rangers, trying to shake off the growing dread. As we discussed the plan, I caught a glimpse of the child from the family had encountered earlier, standing at the edge of the woods, a grin on his face. But it wasn't just any grin. It was the same twisted smile I had seen on the figure. The realization hit me like a punch in the gut. The child wasn't lost. He was part of whatever was lurking in the woods, and now they had returned, watching, waiting. I had no idea what horrors lay ahead. The laughter echoed again, and I felt the woods close in around me. I've spent years working as a park ranger in the deep woods. My shifts usually consisted of monitoring trails, checking campsites, and ensuring visitors adhered to safety guidelines. Autumn had set in, painting the forest in a tapestry of orange and crimson. The air felt electric, tinged with an anticipation I couldn't quite shake. On this particular evening, I was tasked with patrolling a remote campsite that had recently reported some strange disturbances. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I grabbed my flashlight and set off along the narrow trail leading to the site. The shadows grew longer, twisting into menacing shapes among the trees. The silence felt thick, almost suffocating. I brushed off the unsettling feeling and focused on my job. After all, I had encountered my fair share of oddities in the woods. When I arrived at the campsite, I noticed it was unusually quiet. The fire pit lay cold, and the tents stood like sentinels, their flaps flapping gently in the breeze. I called out to see if anyone was around, but received no answer. A tingle of unease prickled my spine. I began checking the tents one by one. The first tent was empty, save for some gear strewn about. The second tent, however, caught my attention. I unzipped the flap and peered inside. It was dark, the light from my flashlight barely illuminating the space. I stepped in and felt a chill sweep over me. The sleeping bags were rolled up, but something was off. There was a half-eaten granola bar lying on the ground, and a backpack was haphazardly tossed in the corner, as if someone had left in a hurry. My instincts kicked in, and I quickly exited the tent. I decided to check the surrounding area. As I walked deeper into the woods, I felt the air grow heavier. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves, but it carried with it an unsettling whisper. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. I was just being paranoid. That's when I heard a faint sound, almost like a child laughing. I turned, heart pounding in my chest, and started walking towards the direction of the sound. The laughter echoed in a way that sent chills down my spine. It was innocent, yet the deeper I went into the woods, the more distorted it became. It was laced with a hint of something dark, something wrong. As I ventured deeper, I spotted a flicker of light through the trees. I followed it, thinking it might lead me to whoever had been camping. But as I drew closer, the laughter ceased, replaced by a profound silence. I stepped into a clearing and felt my breath catch in my throat. There, in the center, stood a massive tree, its gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. At the base of the tree lay a circle of stones, each one covered in strange markings. I crouched to examine them, feeling a sense of dread wash over me. Just then, I heard rustling behind me. I whipped around, flashlight beams slicing through the darkness. Nothing was there. I was alone, or so I thought. Suddenly, a sharp whisper cut through the air, sending icy fingers creeping up my spine. It was a voice, chillingly familiar, echoing my name. I stumbled backward, heart racing, realizing it sounded just like my sister. Confused and terrified, I called out, asking if anyone was there. The whispers intensified, now blending into a cacophony of voices, all calling my name. My heart pounded louder, drowning out the chaos. I felt disoriented, panic threatening to take hold. Then I spotted something moving in the shadows, a figure darting between the trees. I trained my flashlight on it, revealing a face that made my blood run cold. It was a child, eyes wide and terrified, a look of pure horror etched on her face. I rushed toward her, ready to ask if she was lost. But as I reached her, she opened her mouth, and an unearthly scream erupted from her. The sound shattered the night, reverberating in my chest. I stumbled backward, realizing the child's face was not just frightened, but twisted, warped into something inhuman. I turned to run, but felt a tug on my shirt, yanking me back. I looked down to see skeletal hands emerging from the ground, grasping at me. I screamed and broke free, sprinting back toward the trail, adrenaline coursing through my veins. When I finally reached the safety of my vehicle, I locked the doors, heart racing, hands trembling. I looked back at the woods, expecting to see something, anything, but there was nothing. The eerie laughter had returned, ringing in my ears, echoing my deepest fears. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my truck, shaken, the forest looming dark and silent around me. As dawn broke, I vowed never to return to that spot, never to speak of it again. I thought about the child I saw, and the sinister whispers that echoed through the trees. I knew one thing for certain: the woods were alive with secrets, and some truths were best left buried. As a park ranger, I had always been drawn to the solitude of the deep woods. The crisp air, the sounds of nature, and the occasional visit from campers made the job rewarding. One particular October evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I received a call over the radio. A family had set up camp near a remote area, and they were anxious about strange noises coming from the woods. I assured them I would investigate and headed out with my flashlight and gear. The deeper I ventured into the forest, the darker it became. The trees loomed like ancient sentinels, their branches whispering secrets in the wind. I found the campsite nestled among the pines, a flickering campfire barely illuminating the anxious faces of the family. They were huddled close together, their expressions a mix of fear and concern. I asked what they had heard, and the father, his voice trembling, described a low growl and snapping branches echoing from the woods. The mother clutched her children, eyes wide with terror. I promised to check the perimeter and reassured them that it was likely just a bear or some other wildlife. The family nodded but remained visibly shaken. As I walked beyond their camp, the forest felt alive, each rustle amplifying my anxiety. I swept my flashlight across the darkened trees, scanning for movement. The growling had subsided, replaced by an eerie silence that set my nerves on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. After about 20 minutes of searching, I returned to the family. They looked relieved to see me, but were still on high alert. I suggested they stay close to the fire and try to get some rest while I kept watch. I positioned myself a few yards from their tent, feeling the weight of the darkness pressing in around me. As the hours passed, the silence was punctuated by the occasional crackling of the fire and the distant call of an owl. Then, just as I began to relax, I heard it again, a low growl, deeper this time, resonating through the trees. My heart raced as I shined my flashlight toward the sound, illuminating nothing but the shadows of the forest. I took a deep breath and walked toward the sound, my senses heightened. The growl was now accompanied by snapping twigs. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing an unsettling sight. A tall figure stood at the edge of the trees, its outline indistinct. It looked almost human, but something was wrong. It was too tall, too slender, and it didn't move like a person. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to remain calm. I called out, asking if anyone was there. No response came, just a low growl that echoed back to me. Suddenly, the figure lunged toward me, and I stumbled backward, the beam of my flashlight flickering as I tripped over a root. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding, and ran back to the camp. The family was awake, eyes wide with fear. I told them to pack their things quickly, whatever it was in the woods. I could feel it was not friendly. They hurriedly stuffed their belongings into their bags, their hands trembling. As they finished, I led them to the path back to my truck, keeping my flashlight trained on the darkened trees. Just as we reached the trailhead, the air grew cold, and I turned back to glance at the woods. The figure stood just beyond the tree line, watching us. I felt a chill run down my spine, but pushed the family forward. We hurried to the truck, and I fumbled for the keys, my fingers shaking. Just as I got the door open, a loud crash echoed from the forest, followed by a terrifying roar. I threw the family inside and slammed the door. I could feel the adrenaline surging through me as I started the engine. The headlights illuminated the edge of the woods, revealing the figure again, closer this time, its face twisted in a grotesque grin. I backed out and drove away as fast as I could. The family was silent, and the only sound was the hum of the engine. Finally, I turned to them and asked if they had seen anything. They exchanged confused looks, and then began to speak. The father insisted he had seen the figure, but the children only remembered shadows. The mother looked at me, her eyes wide. Then she pointed to the back of the truck. I turned, and my stomach dropped. There was a face pressed against the window, twisted and contorted, mirroring the grotesque smile I had seen earlier. The moment my heart stopped, the face vanished, leaving only the darkness behind. We all sat in stunned silence, realizing that whatever had been watching us was still out there, lingering just beyond the reach of our light. The cabin was supposed to be a quiet retreat, a chance to disconnect and unwind. My friends and I were overdue for a weekend getaway. So, when we found a secluded cabin in the woods, we jumped at the opportunity. We arrived late Friday evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing. The cabin was exactly what we'd hoped for: old, rustic, and off the beaten path. There was something charming about the creaky floors and the smell of pine in the air. We gathered around the fireplace, laughing and reminiscing, settling in for what promised to be a peaceful weekend. But that first night, something felt off. As the fire crackled, the wind picked up outside, rattling the windows with a strange rhythm. It wasn't the kind of wind that howls, it was like something was tapping on the walls. At first, I tried to ignore it. Maybe it was just branches brushing against the wood. Then came the knocking. It was faint at first, like a soft tap on the front door. I glanced at my friends, but no one seemed to notice. The knock came again, this time louder, followed by a low scraping sound, like someone dragging something heavy along the floor. I froze, heart pounding. It wasn't just the wind. The knocking had a deliberate, almost human quality to it. Did anyone else hear that? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. No one responded immediately. So I stood up and walked to the door, pressing my ear against the wood. I heard nothing but the wind outside, howling against the trees. I slowly backed away, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. The night passed in a strange haze. I couldn't sleep, tossing and turning, hearing the occasional knock on the door and the unsettling scraping sound. But when I checked again, no one was outside. The cabin was still. The next morning, I brushed it off. It had been a long drive, and we were all exhausted. But when we stepped outside to explore the woods, I noticed something strange: footprints in the snow leading toward the cabin, fresh and deep. They weren't from any of us. They circled the cabin before fading into the trees. I didn't say anything at first, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The woods felt too quiet, like the trees were watching us, waiting. We spent the day hiking and enjoying the outdoors, but that night, things took a darker turn. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate, as though someone was walking just beyond the window. I quietly got up, careful not to wake the others, and peeked outside. Nothing, just the snow-covered ground and the trees, swaying in the wind. But then I saw it, a shadow, tall and thin, moving between the trees. It didn't seem to belong to anything. The figure moved with unnatural grace, its silhouette stretching across the snow. I stared for a moment, trying to make sense of it, but when I blinked, it was gone. I bolted back to my bed, my heart racing. I lay there, wide awake, listening, and then I heard the knock. Soft at first, then harder, followed by a voice, faint but unmistakable. "Let me in." I froze. The voice wasn't human. It was ragged, almost distorted. I didn't know who it was or what it wanted, but I wasn't about to find out. I stayed still, too terrified to move, listening as the knocking came again, louder this time, right against the door. It didn't stop. Not until morning. The next day, I told my friends about what happened. They thought I was just spooked, maybe imagining things, but they agreed to leave early. As we packed up the car, I noticed something else. The footprints from the day before weren't just around the cabin, they were leading toward the woods, and they were fresh, but they didn't look like human footprints. They were too large, too deep, and there was something wrong about them. They circled around the cabin, but then, right by the door, there were more marks. Scratches, gouges in the wood, like something had been clawing at it from the outside. We didn't wait around to investigate. We left, and as we drove away, I glanced back at the cabin. The trees surrounding it were unnaturally still, the wind completely absent. We never went back, and I haven't been able to shake the feeling that something followed us. Something that had been waiting for us in those woods. Something that wanted in. What I didn't realize until later was that the knocking wasn't the scariest part. It was the voice, the one that whispered let me in, because when I went back through the photos we took that weekend, I noticed something odd. In the background of one of the pictures, just outside the window, there's a figure standing in the trees, and it's smiling.